Hey guys, tonight we're easing into the long, sticky, surprisingly violent history of rum. The drink that started as a plantation's leftover sludge ended up paying sailors' wages, buying enslaved people on the coast of West Africa, and by 1970 still had the entire British Royal Navy arguing about whether 400 grams of alcohol a day was really such a bad way to run a warship. We're talking about a liquor so central to empire that a British admiral is the reason your grandfather might say grog. A liquor so tied to piracy that a real captain's dying words are said to have blamed it for his death. And a liquor so entangled with the slave trade that historians still argue about how many 100,000 human lives were bought, at least in part, with barrels of it. Welcome to 300 years of sugar, sweat, and proof. Dim the lights if you haven't already, and if you'd like something to fall asleep to, let a fan hum low in the background like wind moving across open water, the kind of sound a ship's rigging might have made on a calm night in the Caribbean 3 centuries ago, for men who weren't nearly as comfortable as you are right now. You're warm, you're dry. Nothing on your skin smells like burnt sugar or salt. That won't be true for most of the people you're about to meet. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. Sometime around 1650, on the tiny, brutally hot island of Barbados, somebody noticed that when sugarcane juice is boiled down into crystallized sugar, it leaves behind a thick, dark, almost useless byproduct called molasses. And when that molasses ferments and gets distilled, it produces something that early English colonists, never a people known for restraint in naming things, decided to call Kill Devil. That's not a nickname historians invented for flavor. It shows up in a 1651 document from Barbados, describing the local liquor as, in the writer's own blunt words, a hot, hellish, and terrible drink, which frankly is one of the more honest product reviews in the historical record. This is the story of rum, the drink nobody planned to invent, that ended up funding empires, arming navies, and, depending entirely on which side of the barrel you were standing, either ruining lives or making the unbearable ones just barely survivable. Before we get to the pirates, the admirals, and the sailors, we have to start where every good, terrible idea starts, with someone looking at garbage and asking, "Can we drink that?" The answer, as it turned out, was yes. Enthusiastically, catastrophically, historically, yes. Barbados in the 1640s was not yet the sugar island the world would come to know. Its earliest English settlers, arriving from 1627 onward, had tried tobacco and cotton first, and both had been mediocre disappointments. Barbadian tobacco, according to surviving trade complaints from the period, was considered some of the worst in the English colonies, a fact that must have stung, considering how much colonial pride was riding on it. Sugar changed everything. By the late 1640s, Dutch traders, many of them recently expelled from Portuguese Brazil, where sugar cultivation had already been perfected, began arriving in Barbados with both the cane cuttings and the technical know-how the English planters lacked. Within a decade, the island transformed from a struggling tobacco colony into what one contemporary Englishman called, without much exaggeration, the most flourishing island in all those American plantations. That flourishing came at an almost unimaginable human cost, which we'll spend an entire chapter with shortly. For now, picture the raw mechanics of it. Sugarcane, once cut, has to be crushed within about 24 to 48 hours, or the juice inside begins to sour, which meant plantations ran their crushing mills nearly around the clock during harvest season, a period that could stretch for 4 to 6 months at a stretch. The cane juice was then boiled in a sequence of increasingly smaller copper kettles. As the water cooked off, workers ladled the thickening syrup from one kettle to the next, closer and closer to an open flame, until it crystallized into raw sugar. What was left over after that crystallization? Thick, dark, still faintly sweet, still loaded with residual sugars the boiling process couldn't extract, was molasses. And Caribbean planters, practical to the point of ruthlessness, were not about to let anything with commercial value simply go to waste. Here's the thing about molasses. Left in a warm barrel in a tropical climate, it doesn't stay inert for long. Wild yeasts, already present in the air and on the equipment, begin converting its residual sugars into alcohol within days. Someone, and history genuinely doesn't record exactly who, which is its own kind of fitting, since so much of early rum production was improvised by enslaved workers whose names were never written down at all, figured out that this half-spoiled. Fermenting molasses could be run through a still and turned into something powerful enough to strip paint. Early Caribbean rum was rough, really rough. A 1740s account from a British naval surgeon described unrefined island rum as capable of producing what he called a furious and short madness in men unaccustomed to it. And given that early stills were crude copper pot contraptions, with none of the filtering technology that would come later, that description was probably not much of an exaggeration. By the 1660s, the drink had a name that had mostly shed kill devil in favor of something shorter. Rumbullion, a word of genuinely disputed origin, possibly derived from an English dialect term meaning a great tumult or uproar, which again tracks. Over the following decades, English speakers sanded that word down to the 4 letters we use today. And once it had a name, it needed a market. And the market it found first, more than anywhere else on Earth, was at sea. We'll get to exactly how that happened. The Royal Navy, the admiral who diluted it, the sailors who nearly mutinied over the dilution, later tonight. But it's worth sitting, just for a moment, with how strange this origin story actually is. An empire's signature spirit, the drink that would eventually be smuggled by American colonists in defiance of British tax law, poured into wooden barrels for pirates crossing the Atlantic, and rationed out daily to sailors of the most powerful navy on the planet, began as the thing left over after you'd already taken what you wanted. Rum wasn't the point of the sugar industry. Rum was what the sugar industry couldn't be bothered to throw away. And that's just the start of it. Because once European planters, merchants, and eventually governments realized what could be built on top of a byproduct, they built an entire economic system around it. One that stretched from the cane fields of Barbados and Jamaica, across the Atlantic to the coast of West Africa, up into the distilleries of colonial New England, and out onto the decks of Navy ships and pirate sloops alike. Molasses became currency. Rum became wages. And an awful lot of human lives got measured, quite literally, in barrels. By the 1660s, Barbados alone was exporting what one contemporary estimate placed at several thousand gallons of rum a year to England and the other American colonies, a number that would look almost quaint compared to what Jamaica would produce within a generation, once the English seized that larger island from Spain in 1655 and began converting it, too, into a sugar and rum economy on an even grander scale. Jamaican rum in particular developed a reputation, one that persists among rum drinkers to this day, for a heavier, funkier, more intensely flavored style, the product of longer fermentation times that let wild yeasts do more of their work before distillation. Barbadian producers, meanwhile, leaned toward a lighter, smoother profile that would eventually become closely associated with the very naval rations we're about to spend a great deal of time inside. Here's what's easy to miss in a story this old. None of it was inevitable. There was no meeting where European colonial planners sat down and decided, let's build a transatlantic liquor economy out of sugar waste. It accreted, decision by opportunistic decision, the way most historical catastrophes and historical windfalls actually do. A planter with surplus molasses and no easy way to ship it profitably back to Europe realizes he can distill it locally instead, cutting shipping costs and creating a product with a much longer shelf life than raw cane juice ever had. A sea captain realizes that rum survives long ocean voyages far better than beer, which souring in the tropical heat, or wine, which was expensive and didn't travel especially well either. A colonial government realizes it can tax the stuff, and within 2 generations of that first documented hot, hellish, and terrible drink in 1651, rum wasn't a curiosity anymore. It was infrastructure. We're going to spend the rest of tonight following that infrastructure outward, into the boiling houses where it was actually made, onto the decks where it was rationed and fought over, into the hands of a naval admiral who tried to weaken it and nearly caused a mutiny for his trouble, into the legend of the most famous pirate who ever supposedly cursed it with his last breath, and all the way forward to a single afternoon in 1970 when the Royal Navy finally, quietly let the tradition go. But that's a long way off yet. For now, picture Barbados in the 1650s, heat that doesn't break even after sunset, copper kettles that never quite stop boiling during harvest season, and barrels of a drink nobody set out to invent, already beginning the long, complicated journey toward becoming one of the most consequential liquids in the history of the Atlantic world. The pricing of this newly profitable liquid tells its own quiet story about how quickly rum moved from curiosity to serious commercial commodity. Surviving Barbadian trade records from the 1660s and 1670s show rum consistently fetching a meaningful price on both the local island market and in shipments back to England and the North American mainland colonies, cheap enough relative to imported French brandy or Madeira wine, to undercut both as the everyday drink of choice for ordinary colonists and sailors alike, while still profitable enough per gallon that planters had every incentive to keep expanding production rather than simply discarding their surplus molasses as waste, the way earlier generations of sugar producers elsewhere had often done. That price gap, cheaper than the alternatives, strong enough to do its job in a single modest serving, durable enough to survive a long sea voyage without spoiling the way beer or wine often did, is, in fairly blunt commercial terms, the entire reason rum went on to conquer naval rations, pirate ships, and colonial taverns all at once, rather than remaining a regional Caribbean curiosity. It didn't win on romance or reputation. It won, first and most fundamentally, on being the cheapest reliable way to get a very large number of people across a very large ocean modestly and dependably intoxicated. Even the name itself carries a small mystery, the kind historians still quietly argue about at conferences. Rumbullion is the leading theory, but it's not the only one. Some etymologists have pointed to rumbustious, an English word for rowdy behavior that was already circulating around the same period. Others have suggested a link to a Romani or Roma language term for strong or potent, carried into English through Britain's own internal linguistic borrowing. A few have even floated a connection to rum as an Old English slang word meaning simply excellent or the best of its kind, as in a rum fellow or a rum deal, phrases that survived in British slang well into the 20th century. No single explanation has ever definitively won out. And honestly, that feels appropriate for a drink whose actual invention was just as undocumented and informal as its name. Quality control, in those first decades, was not exactly scientific. Buyers and sellers needed a fast, portable way to check whether a barrel of rum had been watered down by an unscrupulous merchant. A real and constant risk in a trade where the product was liquid, valuable, and moving through the hands of a lot of people with an incentive to cheat. Their solution was what came to be called the gunpowder proof test. A small amount of rum would be mixed with gunpowder and set alight. If the gunpowder still ignited after being soaked, the rum was judged strong enough, proved, in the language of the trade, to be worth its asking price. If the dampened powder failed to catch, the rum was declared under proof, likely watered down, and its price dropped accordingly. This is, quite literally, where the modern term proof, as in 80 proof or 100 proof, comes from, a measurement system born out of 18th century paranoia about being swindled, verified with an open flame next to a barrel of flammable liquid, on a wooden ship, which is a detail that should probably concern you more than it apparently concerned anyone at the time. Barbados and Jamaica weren't the only players. French colonists in Martinique and Guadeloupe were producing their own cane spirit around the same period, generally calling it tafia or gildiv, and for a time French colonial law actually worked against them. Louis Siv's finance minister, protecting the domestic French brandy industry back home, restricted colonial rum production and export well into the early 18th century, a policy that frustrated French planters watching their English rivals in Barbados and Jamaica build a booming Atlantic trade, largely unencumbered by that kind of protectionism. The Dutch, meanwhile, were distilling in their own Caribbean holdings, and, crucially, were often the ones supplying the copper stills and technical expertise that let English planters get their own rum industry off the ground in the first place. A reminder that even at this early stage, rum's history was never a single nation story. It was already international, already competitive, and already tangled up in the kind of trade politics that would only get more complicated as the century wore on. And rum picked up a reputation almost immediately as something more than just an intoxicant. Ship surgeons and colonial physicians in the mid to late 1600s routinely prescribed watered rum for ailments ranging from fevers to digestive complaints to general fatigue. Not because it was an especially effective medicine by any modern standard, but because reliably clean drinking water was a genuine and constant problem on long sea voyages and in tropical settlements. And alcohol, whatever its other issues, at least killed the bacteria that untreated water often carried. This is also roughly when rum punch enters the historical record, a mixture of rum, water, citrus, sugar, and spice that colonial accounts from Jamaica and Barbados describe being served at both formal gatherings and roadside taverns by the 1690s, and which would go on to become one of the defining social rituals of the entire Caribbean colonial world, served in massive communal bowls at everything from plantation weddings to naval celebrations. Rum, in other words, wasn't just being drunk. It was already being built into the daily infrastructure of colonial life, medicine, water purification, social lubricant, and celebration, all poured from the same barrel. Rum wasn't even the only spirit of its type circling the globe by this point, and it's worth a brief detour to see how the same basic idea, distilling something from whatever sugary or starchy raw material happened to be locally abundant, kept reinventing itself wherever European colonial economies took root. In Portuguese Brazil, sugar planters had been distilling their own cane spirit, cacha, since at least the mid-1500s, a full century before Barbados's Kill Devil enters the historical record, developed independently through broadly the same accidental process of not wanting to waste a valuable byproduct. Across the Indian Ocean world, colonial traders and local producers alike distilled, a rack from an even wider range of raw materials depending on the region. Fermented palm sap in parts of South and Southeast Asia, rice in others, a spirit that British and Dutch trading companies imported into Europe in real volume throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, often blended into the same taverns and punch bowls that were simultaneously serving Caribbean rum. None of these parallel spirits directly caused or were caused by rum's own rise. They developed side by side, largely independently, evidence less of any single inventive genius than of a fairly simple, fairly universal human impulse, faced with a valuable, sugar-rich or starch-rich byproduct that would otherwise go to waste. Somebody in nearly every corner of the colonial world eventually asked the same question and reached for a still. Jamaica's entry into this same rum economy once England wrested the island away from Spain in 1655, happened on a scale that would eventually dwarf Barbados's own earlier head start. Jamaica is simply a much larger island, roughly 26 times the land area of Barbados, and English planters, arriving with the sugar and rum model already proven profitable on the smaller island, expanded plantation agriculture across Jamaica's interior with striking speed across the following decades. By the early 1700s, Jamaica had overtaken Barbados as the single largest sugar-producing English colony in the Caribbean, and its rum, distilled in generally larger batches with longer fermentation times than the Barbadian style favoured, developed the heavier, more intensely flavoured reputation that rum drinkers still associate with Jamaican rum today. That expansion came, inevitably, with an expansion of exactly the same brutal labour system already at work in the Barbadian boiling houses, a scaling up of both the industry's profitability and its human cost that the following chapter is going to examine directly, rather than leave as an abstraction sitting comfortably alongside talk of flavour profiles and fermentation times. By the 1680s, rum had crossed the Atlantic in the other direction too, arriving in the North American mainland colonies in quantities substantial enough that towns like Newport and Boston were importing Caribbean molasses specifically to distill their own local rum rather than shipping the finished product all the way from Barbados. That colonial New England rum industry, smaller, cruder, and considerably cheaper than the Caribbean originals in its earliest years, would eventually grow into one of the most economically and morally consequential industries in early American history, feeding directly into the transatlantic slave trade in ways we'll spend an entire chapter untangling later tonight. But that's still generations away. In the 1680s, it was simply another market, another set of ships, another set of merchants, figuring out how to move an increasingly valuable liquid around an increasingly interconnected Atlantic world. What none of those early distillers, merchants, or physicians could have predicted was just how far this leftover sludge from the sugar boiling process was about to travel, not just in miles, but in significance. Within a few decades, rum wouldn't just be a colonial curiosity or a byproduct market. It would be woven into the daily rhythm of the most powerful navy on Earth, the currency of a triangular trade that reshaped 3 continents, and thanks to one particularly memorable and particularly grim historical figure, the substance forever linked, fairly or not, to the popular image of the pirate. But before any of that, someone still had to make it. Someone still had to stand over those boiling copper kettles in heat that regularly topped 40 degrees Celsius, stirring sugar syrup that could burn straight through skin if it splashed, day after day, for months at a stretch. What that drink actually cost to produce, measured not in shillings, but in human hours, human bodies, and human lives, is where we have to go next. The boiling houses didn't run themselves, and the sugar that came out the other end, along with the sludge that would one day become somebody's rum, passed through hands that history rarely bothered to name. You wake before the sun does, which on a Barbados sugar plantation in the 1680s is not a metaphor, it's a job requirement. The air already carries a faint sweetness, the smell of yesterday's boiling still clinging to the timber walls of the huts, mixed with wood smoke and the particular damp earth smell of a Caribbean morning before the heat sets in. For a moment, before you're fully awake, it's almost pleasant. That moment does not last. Harvest season on a mid-sized Barbadian plantation means the mill runs nearly around the clock, because cut cane starts losing its sugar content within a day or two, and the estate's entire annual income depends on getting every possible pound of crystallized sugar out of every stalk before it sours. You are one of somewhere between 80 and 150 enslaved people working this particular estate. Plantation sizes varied enormously. but a substantial Barbadian or Jamaican sugar estate by the late 17th century commonly held a labor force in that range, and during crop time, the work gangs rotate through the fields. The mill and the boiling house in shifts that can run 18 hours or longer. The bad news, today, you're assigned to the boiling house. The worst news, everyone considers the boiling house the hardest, most dangerous posting on the entire estate, and there's a reason for that you're about to learn firsthand. Here's the thing about a plantation boiling house: it is, structurally speaking, an assembly line for burns. Cane juice is ladled by hand from one enormous open copper kettle to the next, usually a sequence of 4 or 5, each smaller than the last, as it thickens and gets steadily hotter, moving closer to a roaring open fire with every transfer. The kettles themselves can be 4 feet across. The syrup inside, by the final stages, is close to boiling and clings like tar. A single misstep on a wet, sugar-slicked stone floor, a single slip while ladling between kettles, and molten sugar syrup meets exposed skin. Colonial records from Caribbean sugar estates in this era document exactly this kind of accident with grim regularity, severe enough that some plantations kept a hatchet mounted near the boiling train specifically, so that a worker whose arm had become trapped or badly burned in machinery could be freed immediately. A detail that tells you almost everything about how the estate's owners weighed. The value of a limb against the value of a few uninterrupted minutes of production. By your 3rd hour at the kettles, your forearms are already slick with a mixture of sweat and cane residue, and the smell of burnt sugar, sharp, almost chemical at this concentration, nothing like the warm dessert smell it becomes once diluted, has stopped registering as a smell at all, and started registering as a physical pressure behind your eyes. This is where you meet Abina, the boiling house's senior sugar boiler, a woman most of the gang defers to without being told to. She's been running this particular set of kettles for 11 years, which on a Caribbean sugar estate, where average life expectancy for enslaved laborers in this brutal early period was measured in single-digit years after arrival, according to historical demographic estimates for Barbados in this period, makes her something close to an institution. She doesn't waste words. She shows you, once, exactly how far to tilt the ladle, exactly how to read the color and the way the syrup strings off the paddle to know which kettle it's ready to move to next. Get it right, and the sugar crystallizes properly. Get it wrong, and months of cane-cutting labor turns to scorched, worthless char in a matter of seconds, which is, unsurprisingly, treated as a serious offense. Congratulations, you've just learned that on a sugar plantation, skill isn't just useful. It's the only thin buffer between you and the estate's much crueler alternatives, and everyone in the boiling house knows it. The scale of what an estate like this one actually demanded, in purely human terms, is worth stating plainly, rather than leaving as an abstraction. Because the boiling house you're standing in is only ever one part of a much larger machine. Demographic reconstructions of Barbados's enslaved population during this period, drawn from surviving estate inventories and parish records, show death rates so severe during the worst decades of the sugar boom that some historians studying the island's population figures have concluded the enslaved population would have declined even without any further importation at all, sustained only by the constant arrival of newly enslaved people transported from West Africa to replace those the system had already worked to death. That's not a detail meant to numb you with a large, abstract number. It's meant to do the opposite, to make clear that Abina's 11 years at the kettles, remarkable enough that the rest of the gang treated her almost as an institution, was itself a kind of statistical anomaly on an island where survival past even a handful of years following arrival was, for a great many enslaved laborers, genuinely uncertain. By midday, the heat inside the boiling house is genuinely dangerous. Contemporary accounts from planters and visitors alike describe boiling house temperatures that, combined with the physical exertion of hauling and ladling, produced heat exhaustion as a routine, almost expected hazard of the job, not an unusual one. There's no midday break built into crop time the way there might be during slower parts of the agricultural year. Water is available, but it's warm, and it does almost nothing against a heat this relentless. You watch one of the younger boys on your gang, a mill feeder, no older than 12, whose job is to push cut cane stalks into the grinding rollers, stumble slightly on his way past, catch himself, and keep moving before anyone in authority notices. Abina catches your eye. Neither of you says anything. There's nothing useful to say, but she slows her own pace for the next several minutes. Just enough that the boy, following her rhythm without being told to, gets a few extra seconds to recover before the next round of kettles needs tending. That's not sentimentality. It's survival, distributed quietly among people who have almost no other resource to distribute. Sunday, on most Caribbean sugar estates by this period, is at least nominally a day off from estate labor, and on that day, enslaved workers with access to a small provision plot are permitted, and in fact often practically required by the estate's own food economics, to grow and sell surplus yams, plantains and vegetables at local markets, keeping whatever small amount of money that trade generates. It's an almost unbearably narrow space of autonomy carved out of an otherwise near total system of control. A market economy built and sustained entirely by enslaved people themselves. On the one day a week, the estate's machinery briefly falls silent. Abina, you learn over the following weeks, has used exactly that market, patiently, for years, to buy small comforts for herself and occasionally for the newer arrivals in the boiling house gang. A length of better cloth, a cooking pot, once, memorably, a small mirror that got passed around the whole hut for a week before she quietly reclaimed it. 3 weeks into crop time, the rhythm of it has become almost automatic. Cut, crush, boil, ladle, crystallize, repeat. And that automatic quality is exactly what makes the accidents more likely, not less, because exhaustion erodes the careful attention the work actually requires. This is when you first watch the byproduct economy up close. What's left in the final kettle after the sugar crystals have been skimmed and packed isn't thrown out. It's molasses, thick and dark and still faintly sweet, and it gets funneled into large wooden vats near the estate's small still house, set aside to ferment. Nobody in the boiling house particularly celebrates this part of the process. The rum that will eventually come out of those vats isn't destined for the people who made the sugar that produced it. It will mostly be shipped, sold, or in some cases handed out in small, tightly rationed quantities as a kind of estate currency. A reward doled out at the owner's discretion rather than anything resembling fair compensation. You've heard, second-hand, from a field hand named Cudjoe, who overheard it from a house servant, that the estate's overseer received an entire cask of the plantation's own rum as part of his annual pay. A detail that lands with a particular kind of bitterness once you understand exactly whose labor produced it. By the time the crop season finally winds down, typically stretching from roughly January through June on a Barbadian estate, according to the agricultural calendars recorded in period planter correspondence, you've survived one full boiling house rotation, which is not a small thing. Abina hasn't. Not because of an accident, and not because of illness, but because in the estate's brutal internal economy, skilled boilers were sometimes sold to other estates that needed that specific expertise more urgently, with no more warning or consultation than you'd give a piece of equipment being transferred to a job that needed it. She's gone one morning. Simply gone. And the boiling house gang absorbs the loss the way it absorbs everything. Quietly, functionally, Because the kettles don't stop needing attention just because someone who mattered to you is no longer standing at them. The younger mill feeder boy, the one Abina had quietly slowed her pace for, is the one who ends up teaching you the particular tilt of the ladle she'd taught him, passing forward the one piece of knowledge and the one piece of care that she'd had room to give. That, more than anything else from the boiling house, is worth sitting with for a moment. In a system built entirely to strip people of control over their own lives, over their own bodies, over who they stood next to at a set of boiling kettles, small transfers of skill, small acts of pacing yourself to protect someone weaker. Small Sunday markets built and run entirely by the people the system was designed to exploit were not nothing. They were not enough. They were never going to be enough against a system this total. But they were real, documented, and they persisted anyway, generation after generation, on estate after estate across Barbados and Jamaica and every other sugar island in the Caribbean, for as long as the industry itself persisted. The quiet sabotage and careful pacing you've watched play out in your own boiling house gang sat, historically, alongside far larger, more organized acts of resistance across Barbados and the wider Caribbean. Acts that estate owners spent enormous energy trying to detect and suppress, precisely because they understood how real the threat was. Colonial records document a planned uprising on Barbados in 1675, uncovered before it could be carried out, involving enslaved people from multiple estates coordinating in secret, and another conspiracy uncovered in 1692. Both met with brutal, exemplary executions specifically designed to terrify the wider enslaved population into abandoning any similar plans. These weren't isolated events. Similar conspiracies, uprisings, and organized resistance efforts recur throughout the documented history of Caribbean sugar colonies across the 17th and 18th centuries, evidence that the outward, functioning calm of a plantation's daily boiling house routine. The ladling, the singing, the careful Sunday markets existed alongside a current of organized defiance that never fully went away, no matter how brutally individual attempts at it were punished. You won't hear about any of that directly in the boiling house itself. Word of it moves the way most dangerous information moved on an estate like this one, in fragments, half overheard, passed carefully between people who trusted each other enough to risk the conversation at all. There's one more piece of the boiling house economy worth knowing, because it's almost too ironic to be real. Except that period planter records confirm it happened on estate after estate, during the most punishing stretches of crop time. Some plantation owners issued small rum rations directly to the enslaved workers doing the hardest labor, the cane cutters, the mill feeders, the boiling gang, specifically because a small dose of alcohol was believed to help workers push through exhaustion and keep the harvest moving at the pace the estate's finances demanded. You are, in other words, sometimes handed a mouthful of the very drink your own labor is producing, not as a kindness, but as fuel, dispensed with the same calculating logic an estate might apply to feeding a plough horse a bit more grain before a long day pulling furrows. It doesn't taste like much of anything after the 4th or 5th hour at the kettles. It does, for a few minutes, make your arms feel less like they belong to someone else. That same calculating logic ran in the other direction too, and this is where the boiling house gang's quieter forms of resistance actually lived. An enslaved sugar boiler with real skill, someone like Abina had been, held a strange, narrow kind of leverage that a field hand cutting cane in open sun simply didn't have. Because a batch of scorched, ruined sugar syrup, timed just wrong, just often enough to look like ordinary human error rather than deliberate sabotage, cost an estate real money and could not be easily traced to intent. Historians studying Caribbean plantation records have long noted this pattern. A stubbornly high rate of accidental spoilage and breakage clustered suspiciously around estates known for the harshest treatment. evidence that enslaved workers understood and quietly exploited the few pressure points a plantation's own profit motive left exposed. It was never a solution. It never freed anyone, but it meant the system wasn't running quite as smoothly, quite as totally, as the man who owned the estate liked to believe it was. And there was something, not justice, nothing close to justice, but something in that. By the final weeks of the season, the work has changed you in ways you notice mostly in small physical facts. A permanent set of scars along one forearm from a splash of syrup you'd managed to survive without losing function in the arm. A callous pattern on your palms that matches almost exactly the ladle handle you've used for months, a habit of instinctively flinching at any sudden hiss of liquid meeting hot metal that Abina's replacement, a broad-shouldered man everyone calls Quacko, tells you will probably never fully go away. Quacko arrived from a smaller estate 2 islands over, sold off after that estate's owner ran into debt, and he carries with him a set of boiling techniques slightly different from the ones Abina taught. Techniques he learned from an older boiler on his previous estate, whose name he still says with a kind of quiet respect whenever he corrects your ladle angle. Knowledge like this moved the way almost everything of value moved in this system, person to person, off the books, unrecorded by any estate ledger, surviving forced sales and separations, because the people carrying it refused to let it simply disappear, along with everything else that had been taken from them. What persisted through all of it? The burns, the heat, the 12-year-old mill feeders, the casual brutality of a skilled woman sold away without warning, was something the historical record keeps circling back to whenever it bothers to look closely. A network of enslaved people teaching each other trades, tending each other's injuries, timing their labor to protect the weakest among them, and building. On the 1 day a week, the estate's machinery went quiet, a market economy entirely their own. It didn't undo the system. Nothing available to them could have undone a system built with that much deliberate, calculated cruelty. But it meant that the sugar and the rum leaving that estate's boiling house every season had, embedded invisibly in every barrel, the fingerprints of people who found a way to remain fully human inside a system engineered to deny them exactly that. There's a sound that belongs to the boiling house too, one that period accounts from visitors to Caribbean sugar estates mention almost in passing, as though it was simply part of the machinery rather than something the workers themselves created and sustained. Call and response singing, timed to the rhythm of ladling and stirring, ran through the boiling house nearly constantly during crop time, work songs whose lyrics rarely survive in any written form, since almost none of the people singing them were permitted to read or write, but whose function historians studying enslaved labor across the Caribbean have documented consistently. Coordinating the physical timing of dangerous, repetitive tasks, and, just as importantly, giving a gang of exhausted people something that belonged to them. Something the estate's overseer couldn't ladle out, ration, or take away. Quacko, in the weeks after he arrives, brings with him a handful of call phrases from his previous estate, and you watch them blend, awkwardly at first and then more naturally, into the rhythm the gang had already built for itself. A small, ongoing act of cultural survival happening in real time, verse by verse, inside a building designed for nothing but extraction. None of this made the boiling house survivable in any complete sense. Men and women still lost fingers, forearms, sometimes their lives, to those open copper kettles. The estate's ledgers still recorded the sugar and the rum as assets, and recorded the people producing both as another kind of asset entirely. A horror this account has no interest in softening or explaining away, but the songs kept moving through the heat and the smoke anyway, verse after verse, gang after gang, plantation after plantation, for as long as the industry itself lasted, a thin, defiant thread of something that was never supposed to survive a system built specifically to erase it, and did anyway. The sugar from that boiling house made its way onto ships bound for England. The rum, eventually, made its way onto a great many more ships than that, some flying English colours, some flying no colours at all, and a good number of them about to become the property of men who called themselves pirates. Pirates get all the credit for rum's naval reputation, but long before any Jolly Roger went up a mast, the Royal Navy had already built an entire daily ritual around the stuff, and one very irritable admiral is the reason that ritual came with water in it. On the morning of August 21st, 1740, somewhere in the waters off the West Indies, sailors aboard several ships of a British naval squadron lined up for their daily rum ration, and discovered, to what surviving accounts describe as genuine and vocal outrage, that it wasn't what they were expecting. The rum was still there. But it had been mixed, roughly 1 part rum to 4 parts water, poured into a large tub on deck, and doled out in 2 servings rather than 1 solid pour. Some accounts from the period describe grumbling serious enough to worry the officers present that they were watching the early stages of a mutiny. This is the story of grog, the drink that changed the entire culture of the Royal Navy, born out of one admiral's irritation and one very unpopular order. The man behind the order was Vice Admiral Edward Vernon, and by 1740 he already had a reputation, both for genuine tactical brilliance and for being, by most contemporary accounts, a fairly difficult man to serve under. Vernon had made his name the previous year at the Battle of Portobello, where in November 1739 he captured the Spanish-held port in present-day Panama with a squadron of just 6 ships. A victory so celebrated back in Britain that it was commemorated in place names still on the map today, including a street in London that would eventually be called Portobello Road. That win made Vernon a genuine celebrity, the kind of naval hero whose birthday got toasted in taverns he'd never set foot in. It also gave him the standing, by the following year, to make sweeping changes to how his ships were run, and one of the things that had long bothered him was what a full, undiluted rum ration was doing to his crews. Here's the problem Vernon was actually trying to solve. Since 1731, the Royal Navy had an official standard ration of a half pint of rum per sailor per day, a substantial amount of alcohol by any measure, especially handed to men also expected to climb rigging, load cannon, and operate dangerous machinery. Rum had become the Navy's preferred ration spirit gradually over the preceding decades, largely for practical reasons. Beer, the earlier standard, spoiled quickly in tropical heat and took up far more cargo space per unit of alcohol delivered, while rum, high-proof and shelf-stable, solved both problems at once. Particularly after Britain's 1655 seizure of Jamaica gave the Navy direct access to a major rum-producing colony. But an undiluted half-pint ration, drunk neat, produced exactly the results you'd expect. Sailors who hoarded several days' rations to drink all at once, sailors too intoxicated to perform basic duties, and, recorded with some regularity in ship's logs from the period, sailors who died from what would today be recognized as acute alcohol poisoning after exactly this kind of binge drinking. Vernon's solution, issued as a formal order to his squadron, was to cut the rum with water before serving it, specifically to make hoarding pointless. Watered rum spoils and separates within a day or two, so there was no longer any advantage to saving up your ration for a bigger hit later. He also split the ration into 2 servings, one around midday and one in early evening, rather than one large pour, further reducing the odds of anyone getting catastrophically drunk in a single sitting. It was, by most modern assessments, a genuinely sensible piece of naval reform. It was also, to the men receiving it, an infuriating insult, and they were not shy about saying so. The nickname arrived almost immediately, and it stuck with a permanence few naval slang terms ever achieve. Vernon had a habit of wearing a coat made of a coarse silk and wool fabric called grogram, and sailors, with the particular cruelty of men looking for someone to blame, had already taken to calling him Old Grogram or Old Grog behind his back, long before the watered rum order. When that order arrived, the sailors simply transferred the nickname straight onto the drink itself. Grog, a word coined, essentially, as an insult aimed at an admiral that would go on to outlive the man, outlive his navy, and eventually enter everyday English as a generic term for watered-down alcohol of any kind. What none of the furious sailors lining up for their diluted ration in 1740 could have known was that Vernon's order, for reasons that had nothing to do with his actual intentions, was quietly making them healthier. Later versions of the grog ration, formalized over subsequent decades, commonly included a measure of sugar and citrus juice, lemon or lime, added to make the watered rum more palatable. That citrus addition turned out to be doing something far more important than improving flavor. It was delivering a regular dose of vitamin C to men on long ocean voyages, at a time when scurvy remained one of the deadliest threats a sailor faced, killing more men across the age of sail, by most historians' estimates, than combat, storms, and shipwreck combined. The formal scientific link between citrus and scurvy prevention wouldn't be established until naval surgeon James Lynn's controlled trial aboard Miss Salisbury in 1747, 7 years after Vernon's order, and it would take the Royal Navy several more decades after that to make citrus rations mandatory fleet-wide. But the grog ritual, born entirely out of one admiral's desire to stop his men from getting catastrophically drunk, ended up as an accidental, unintentional head start on one of the great medical discoveries of the 18th century. And it's a large part of why British sailors picked up the nickname limeys from other nations' navies in the first place. The stakes of getting the ration wrong, in either direction, were higher than a modern reader might assume, and the Royal Navy's own history includes at least one sobering reminder of exactly how volatile shipboard grievances over rations, rum very much included, could become. The 1797 mutinies at Spithead and the Nore, two of the largest and most serious mass mutinies in Royal Navy history, involving tens of thousands of sailors across dozens of ships, were driven primarily by disputes over pay and provisions rather than rum specifically. But surviving accounts of the sailors' formal lists of grievances submitted to the Admiralty during the Spithead Mutiny do include complaints about short-measured rations generally, rum among them, alongside far more serious concerns about pay that hadn't been raised in over a century. The mutinies were eventually resolved through a mixture of concession and, at the Nore in particular, brutal suppression. But they stand as a genuine reminder that the daily rituals this chapter has spent so much time describing warmly were embedded in an institution capable of real, sometimes deadly conflict between the men who served in it and the officers who governed them. Grog was comfort and ceremony. But it existed inside a system that could, and periodically did, push its sailors past what they were willing to tolerate. Not every sailor experienced the change the same way, and it's worth being honest about how gradually and unevenly grog actually replaced the old undiluted ration across the fleet. Vernon's order applied only to his own squadron in 1740. It took until 1756 for the Admiralty to formally mandate watered rum across the entire Royal Navy, a 16-year gap during which crews on different ships were, quite literally, drinking under different rules depending on which admiral they happened to serve. Even after 1756, the exact water-to-rum ratio and serving customs varied by ship and by era. Later regulations in 1824 reduced the daily ration itself, cutting it roughly in half from its earlier levels, as naval reformers grew increasingly uneasy about how much alcohol they were routinely handing armed men operating dangerous machinery. By 1850, the ration had been cut again. The ritual itself, though, the daily muster at the grog tub, the particular language that grew up around it, proved remarkably durable. And we're going to spend real time inside that daily ritual a little later tonight, walking through exactly what up spirit sounded like, smelled like, and meant to the ordinary sailors who lived by it for 2 centuries after Vernon's furious, watered-down order first went out. The word itself didn't stay confined to naval decks for long, and its spread into everyday English is its own small telling story about just how central this ritual became to 18th century British culture more broadly. Within a few decades of Vernon's order, groggy had entered common usage as a general term for unsteadiness or disorientation, not necessarily alcohol-related at all. Simply borrowed from the specific, recognizable sway of a man who'd had a bit too much watered rum, and it survives in that exact sense in English today, centuries after most people using it have any idea it originated with one irritable admiral's coat. Few naval customs of this era left a linguistic footprint quite that durable. Most of the era's shipboard slang stayed confined to sailors and the occasional novelist trying to sound authentic. Grog escaped the ship entirely and became part of ordinary civilian speech. A small but genuine measure of just how thoroughly this one ritual had worked its way into British cultural consciousness by the time it had barely finished becoming standard practice across the fleet. The ritual around grog grew its own vocabulary almost as quickly as it grew its nickname, and some of that vocabulary is worth sitting with, because it tells you exactly how central this daily pour became to shipboard social life. Sailors who received a larger-than-normal ration as thanks for a favour, as a wages payoff, or simply out of a friend's generosity, called it sippers, a small top-up sipped rather than gulped. A full extra tot, handed over outright, was a gulper. These weren't official Navy terms, they were invented informally by the men themselves, and they functioned as a kind of shipboard currency running parallel to actual money, used to settle small debts, repay favours, and smooth over minor grievances in a social world where very few sailors had ready cash on hand, but nearly everyone had, at minimum, the promise of tomorrow's tot. Ships' logs and later oral histories from the ration's long life describe entire informal economies built on nothing but the promise of a sipper owed and eventually collected. Proof that even a heavily regulated, watered-down ritual could be bent, socially, into something the sailors themselves partly controlled. Not everyone on board received the same treatment, and it's worth being honest about who was excluded from the ritual, because the exclusions tell you almost as much as the ration itself. Boys serving as powder monkeys or ship's servants, some as young as 12 or 13, doing genuinely dangerous work running gunpowder to the ship's cannon during battle, typically received either a much smaller ration or none at all, under most 18th century regulations, officially on the grounds that full-strength grog wasn't appropriate for children performing physical labor, though in practice the rule was inconsistently enforced across different ships and different captains. Officers, meanwhile, generally drew from separate stores entirely, often wine or higher-quality spirits purchased at their own expense rather than the standard-issue grog doled out to the lower deck. A small but telling detail about how rigidly the Navy's rum culture still tracked the same class lines that governed almost everything else about shipboard life. Grog didn't just create a social economy. It created genuine disciplinary headaches that Admiralty officials spent the better part of 2 centuries trying to manage. Ship's pursers, the officers responsible for measuring and distributing supplies including the daily rum ration, had both the access and, given how poorly paid the position often was, the temptation to skim a portion of each day's allotment for private resale, a fraud serious and common enough that naval regulations of the period specifically addressed false measure in rum distribution as a punishable offence. And despite Vernon's watering down specifically designed to prevent binge drinking, sailors proved endlessly creative at working around it anyway, trading sippers and gulpers back and forth until one man on a given day ended up dangerously intoxicated, regardless of how carefully the official ration had been measured out that morning. Flogging remained the standard punishment for drunkenness on duty throughout most of this period, which creates the genuinely strange historical picture of a navy that officially rationed alcohol to its sailors every single day, and then routinely punished the ones who overindulged on exactly the substance it had just handed them. There was, at least, a version of the ritual that everyone on board could look forward to without reservation, and it survives in naval tradition even now, decades after the actual daily ration itself was discontinued: the order to splice the mainbrace. Originally a genuine piece of nautical work, repairing the mainbrace, a critical piece of rigging, was physically demanding enough that crews completing it were traditionally rewarded with an extra tot of rum. The phrase evolved over the following century into a general order for an extra ration, issued to celebrate victories, coronations, royal births, or any other occasion an admiral judged worth marking, with a round of grog for the entire ship. It's still used today, informally, by the Royal Navy on ceremonial occasions, even though the daily grog ration it once supplemented has been gone since 1970, a phrase that outlived the very custom it was born to celebrate. What none of this daily ritual had anything to do with, despite the popular imagination's insistence otherwise, was piracy, at least not directly. The Royal Navy's grog culture and the drinking culture aboard pirate vessels of the same era developed along genuinely separate, if occasionally overlapping tracks. Naval rum was official, rationed, watered, and taxed. Pirate rum, as we're about to see, operated under an entirely different, far less regulated set of rules. Rules that pirate crews remarkably wrote and voted on themselves. The ration's long, gradual shrinkage across the 19th century, from Vernon's original half-pint, watered down but still substantial, to the considerably smaller allowance sailors would eventually draw by the time of Black Tot Day itself, didn't happen in a vacuum, and it's worth noting the broader cultural current pushing against it the whole time. The temperance movement, gaining real political and social momentum across both Britain and the United States through the 1800s, increasingly framed any institutionalized daily alcohol ration, naval or otherwise, as a public health and moral concern worth actively campaigning against, and naval reformers sympathetic to that broader movement pushed repeatedly for further reductions to the ration. Across the century, generally citing discipline and efficiency, concerns rather than temperance's own moral arguments directly, but clearly influenced by the same shifting cultural tide regardless. By 1850, official regulation had cut the ration to roughly a quarter of what Vernon's own watered-down 1740 order had originally specified. A reduction sailors of that generation grumbled about with exactly the same wounded resignation their 18th century predecessors had once aimed at Vernon himself. Proof that however much the specific numbers changed across 2 centuries, the sailors' basic relationship to any reduction in their rum, however sensibly justified, never really did. Vernon himself didn't live to see how permanent his accidental invention would become. He continued serving in Parliament as well as the Navy through the 1740s, his relationship with the Admiralty growing steadily more contentious. He was, by most accounts, not a man who softened his opinions for the sake of career advancement, and he was formally dismissed from naval service in 1746 after publishing criticisms of Admiralty policy that his superiors considered insubordinate. He died in 1757, 17 years after that first furious morning of watered rum on deck, having no particular reason to believe that the insult-turned drink his own sailors had named after his coat would still be poured, in a slightly different form, on Royal Navy ships more than 2 centuries later. Grog outlived Old Grogram by 230 years, a strange kind of immortality for a man remembered today, if he's remembered at all. mostly by association with the very drink his sailors invented as a way of complaining about him. Naval sailors drank grog because an admiral told them to, at a ratio an admiral chose, on a schedule an admiral set. Pirates did things differently, and the difference tells you almost everything about why so many sailors chose to become pirates in the first place. The smell hits you before anything else does. Tar, salt, and underneath it, faint but unmistakable, the sweet sour tang of rum that soaked so thoroughly into the deck planking of this sloop that it never quite fades, even weeks after the barrel that spilled it has been emptied and rolled overboard. It's 1718, somewhere in the waters off the Bahamas, and you've just put your mark to a piece of paper that the crew calls the Articles, a set of rules voted on and agreed to by every man aboard. That will govern exactly how this ship operates, how loot gets divided, and, crucially for tonight's purposes, exactly how much rum you're entitled to and under what circumstances you're allowed to drink it. You signed willingly. Not every man on this deck did. Here's the thing about pirate ships that popular imagination consistently gets backward. They were not lawless free-for-alls, where rum flowed without limit, and every man drank himself into oblivion whenever he pleased. Surviving sets of pirate articles, including the well-documented rules attributed to Bartholomew Roberts's crew, recorded by contemporary sources describing his 1721 fleet, specifically restricted heavy drinking after 8 o'clock at night, requiring anyone who wanted to keep drinking past that hour to do it up on the open deck rather than below, specifically to reduce the fire risk of open flame, alcohol, and cramped wooden quarters combining into a catastrophe. Fire was, by a wide margin, one of the things a pirate crew feared most. A wooden ship, far from any port, had nowhere to run from a blaze, and a drunk man with an unattended candle below decks was a threat every single sailor aboard understood immediately, viscerally, without needing it explained twice. This is where you meet Prince, standing near the mainmast, checking the tension on a length of rigging with the unhurried confidence of a man who's done this exact task several thousand times before. Prince had been enslaved on a Jamaican sugar estate before escaping during a chaotic transfer between ships 18 months ago, and rather than being recaptured or returned, he'd been taken on by this crew under the same articles you just signed. Full share, full vote, same rum ration as any other man aboard, a set of terms that, whatever else can be said about pirate crews, offered him a legal and social status categorically different from anything available to him on land. He's the one who shows you, without being asked twice, exactly how the crew's rum stores are managed, locked in the hold, under the direct control of the quartermaster, doled out at set times rather than left freely accessible. Specifically because an earlier crew this ship's veterans had sailed with once nearly lost their vessel when an unsupervised rum store turned an ordinary evening into a chaotic, half-conscious free-for-all, just as a Spanish patrol vessel happened across them. Not every man standing on this deck signed those articles with Prince's degree of genuine choice, and it's worth being honest about that too, because rum played an uncomfortable role in exactly how some of those signatures got obtained. Captured sailors from a taken merchant vessel were regularly given the option to join a pirate crew rather than be set adrift or handed over for ransom, and surviving depositions from captured pirates later standing trial, testimony recorded specifically because defendants had every legal incentive to claim they'd been forced rather than willing, since willing participation carried a much harsher sentence, describe a recurring pattern in which reluctant captives were plied with free-flowing rum during the recruitment pitch, encouraged to drink well past the point of clear judgment before being asked to put their mark on the articles. Some men later swore in court they remembered agreeing to sign only in a drunken haze they deeply regretted by the following morning. Whether that testimony reflected genuine coercion or a convenient legal excuse offered after the fact by men desperate to avoid the noose is, in a fair number of individual cases, genuinely difficult for historians to untangle at this distance. But the tactic itself, using rum specifically to lower a captured man's resistance before asking for his signature, shows up often enough across surviving trial records to suggest it was a real, deliberate recruiting technique, rather than an isolated excuse. By your second week aboard, the daily rhythm has settled into something almost recognizable. A small ration in the evening, larger allowances after a successful prize is taken, and, this is the part that surprises most new hands, genuine debate and voting among the crew whenever a dispute arises about drink, discipline, or division of any kind. The captain of a pirate vessel, contrary to the popular image of an unquestioned tyrant, generally held near total authority only during active combat. At nearly all other times, on well-documented crews like Roberts or Bartholomew Black Bart Roberts' near contemporary, Charles Vane's, major decisions including punishments for serious misconduct went to a vote among the full crew. Rum, in this system, wasn't just a comfort. It was one more thing the crew collectively governed. The same way they governed loot shares, captain selection, and compensation for injury. Because a pirate ship, disturbingly enough for a group of men outside the law, ran on more structured, more democratic principles than the merchant and naval vessels most of these men had left behind. 3 weeks out from that first signing, your ship takes its first prize. A small merchant sloop caught with a mixed cargo that includes, among the sugar and dry goods, 4 full casks of rum, destined for a plantation owner's private stores. The crew's reaction to this particular find borders on genuine celebration, and it's worth understanding why. Rum this good, distilled and aged rather than the rough kill devil most of the crew is used to, was a genuine luxury, and a good haul of it functioned almost like a bonus on top of whatever coin and goods the prize also yielded. That night, under the Article's own rules permitting extended drinking on open deck after a successful action, the crew breaks into the good rum properly for the first time since you signed on, and you get your first real look at what an actual pirate celebration looked like. Singing, genuinely terrible singing, dice games with improvised stakes, and Prince, 3 cups in, telling a story about a Jamaican Sunday market he used to sell yams at. A story that has nothing to do with piracy at all, and everything to do with a life he's not able to go back to. Told to a circle of men who, whatever else divides them, understand exactly what it means to have almost nothing behind you and an uncertain amount of time ahead. Not every pirate crew managed the balance between celebration and discipline this well, and the most famous cautionary counterexample from this same period is worth knowing, because it shows exactly what could go wrong when a crew's rum culture slipped its careful boundaries entirely. In October of 1720, the pirate captain John Calico Jack Rackham and his crew, a vessel that notably included 2 women, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, sailing and fighting alongside the rest of the men under the same articles, were surprised and captured off the coast of Jamaica by a sloop under Captain Jonathan Barnett. Trial testimony recorded afterward, considerably more reliable on this specific point than the embellished popular retelling that grew up around it later, describes most of Rackham's crew as too intoxicated to offer any meaningful resistance when Barnett's men boarded, having spent the preceding hours drinking heavily aboard a captured vessel rather than maintaining any kind of watch. Bonny and Read, by multiple accounts, were reportedly among the only crew members still capable of fighting back at all in the chaos of the boarding, a detail that trial records and subsequent popular retellings alike seized on immediately, for reasons that probably need no further explanation. Rackham was hanged within weeks. It's a stark, well-documented illustration of exactly the risk your own crew's articles had been so carefully designed to prevent. A rum culture that, left unregulated even briefly, at precisely the wrong moment, could turn an entire ship's company from a functioning fighting crew into an easy drunken capture in the space of a single unguarded evening. By the time your ship makes port at Nassau, the loosely governed pirate haven on New Providence Island that through the mid-1710s functioned as something close to an entire town built around prize goods and rum. You get to see what happens when that same rum culture moves off the disciplined deck of a working ship and into a settlement with essentially no functioning colonial government to enforce anything at all. Contemporary accounts from the period describe Nassau's waterfront taverns doing a booming trade in rum punch, and describe pirate crews on liberty spending prize money with a speed that would have shocked the plantation owners whose goods had originally funded it. Some estimates from period accounts suggest a crew could burn through weeks of hard-won plunder in a matter of days ashore. Here's the bad news. This pattern, repeated across crew after crew, meant an enormous number of pirates spent most of their careers essentially broke between prizes, chasing the next haul not to get rich, but simply to get back to even. What happens below decks during a real Nassau bender is, honestly, a different story for a different night. Let's just say the town's already thin colonial oversight got thinner still once the rum started flowing freely, and leave it there for now, because there's a darker, more sobering side of this same rum culture that deserves its own space, and it's coming. 6 weeks after that first prize, your ship engages a small Spanish Coast Guard vessel in a brief, violent skirmish that leaves 2 of your crewmates wounded. One with a shattered hand from a swivel gun mishap, one with a deep cutlass wound along the forearm. This is where the articles matter more than almost anywhere else, because among their most consistently documented provisions across surviving pirate crews' agreements is a compensation scale for injury, 800 pieces of 8, according to the terms attributed to several Golden Age crews. For the loss of a leg or an arm, smaller set amounts for fingers, eyes, or lesser wounds, paid out of the ship's common stock before any other shares were distributed. Prince, it turns out, is the crewmate with the shattered hand, not lost outright, but badly enough damaged that the ship's self-taught surgeon, working with the only tools available and a healthy dose of the very rum you've spent this whole chapter learning about, used a full cup of it as the closest thing to anesthetic the deck has to offer before setting what bones could still be set. Prince survives the setting, keeps most of the function in 3 of his 5 fingers, and, under the articles every man aboard voted to honor, receives his compensation payout in full at the next division of plunder, weeks later, counted out in front of the whole crew rather than negotiated privately where it might have been quietly reduced. It's not justice, in any complete sense. It's not enough to make up for a hand that will never fully close around a rope the way it once did. But it is, by the standards of nearly every other maritime institution operating in the Atlantic world in 1718, naval, merchant, or otherwise, a genuinely unusual thing. A system, however rough and self-interested at its core, that wrote down in advance exactly what a man's suffering was worth, and then, in front of witnesses, actually paid it. Not every task aboard earns you rum quite as directly as a battle wound. But one comes close, and you learn exactly why roughly 2 months into your time aboard, when the ship's hull has picked up enough barnacles and weed that its speed has noticeably dropped. A serious problem for a vessel whose entire strategy depends on outrunning anything it can't outfight. Careening, the process of deliberately beaching the ship on its side in a sheltered cove to scrape and burn the hull clean, is brutal, exhausting work. Every gun, every barrel, every scrap of cargo has to be unloaded first. The ship then hauled over using block and tackle rigged to nearby trees, and the exposed hull scraped clean of barnacles and weed under a beating sun for however many days the job takes, usually somewhere between 1 and 2 weeks depending on the size of the vessel and the state of the hull. It is by wide consensus among the crew the single most miserable regular duty on the entire ship's calendar. And it is also, not coincidentally, one of the moments the article's rum allowance gets stretched furthest. because a crew hauling a fully loaded sloop up a beach by hand needs every possible incentive to keep at it. You watch Prince, still favoring his damaged hand months after the injury, take on a lighter task during the careening, tending the fires used to burn off the worst of the hull's build-up, rather than the heavier hauling work. A quiet accommodation nobody votes on or writes down, simply extended by a crew that spent enough time with him to understand what he can and can't safely do anymore. It's a small thing. It's also, again, not nothing, proof that, even in a system built primarily around shared profit and collective self-interest, some space existed for a crew to look after one of its own, without being told to. Drink also gets you in trouble aboard, and the articles are just as specific about that as they are about compensation. Gambling with dice or cards is restricted or banned outright under several surviving sets of pirate articles. Specifically because disputes over gambling debts, fueled by rum, were a documented and recurring source of violence between crewmates. Men who'd sailed together for months turning on each other over a wager gone bad. Exactly the kind of internal breakdown a small ship far from any law enforcement genuinely could not afford. Theft from a fellow crewmate, including theft of rum from the common stores, was treated with particular severity. Surviving accounts describe punishments ranging from marooning, the practice of abandoning an offender alone, on a deserted spit of sand with little more than a pistol, a small amount of powder and shot, and sometimes a bottle of water, to outright execution for repeated or especially damaging offences. The threat wasn't theoretical. Pirate crews genuinely did maroon their own men over serious violations of trust, and the punishment's entire design, leaving a man conscious, aware, and almost certainly doomed rather than simply killing him outright, tells you something grim about exactly how personally a crew took a betrayal from within its own ranks. Superstition runs through this whole world the same way rum does, and it's worth pausing on one small ritual you witness for the first time during a rough patch of weather roughly 5 months into your service. Because it says something true about how these crews understood the ocean they depended on and feared in roughly equal measure. As a squall builds on the horizon, one of the older hands pours a small measure of rum directly over the rail into the sea before taking his own tot. A gesture Prince explains, when you ask him about it afterward, as a widely observed custom among sailors of many nations and many centuries, a small offering meant to appease whatever power a given sailor believed actually governed the water. Beneath the hull, whether that meant a specific deity, a general sense of maritime luck, or simply an old habit nobody aboard could fully explain the origin of anymore, but nobody was quite willing to be the one who skipped it either. It costs the ship almost nothing. A splash of rum, gone in a second, and it buys in return something no article or vote could ever formally provide. A small, shared moment of collective reassurance against a genuinely dangerous, genuinely unpredictable ocean that none of the ship's careful rules and rations could fully protect anyone from. By the time your first full cruise winds down, call it 4 months from that first signing to the day the crew votes to split up, sell the ship, or seek out a fresh commission. An arc that varied enormously from crew to crew, but rarely stretched much beyond a year or two before some combination of capture, death, pardon, or simple attrition ended it. You've come to understand rum aboard a pirate vessel as something far more structured and far more revealing of what these crews actually valued than the chaotic image handed down through 2 centuries of adventure fiction. It was ration and reward. It was currency and celebration. It was, in Prince's case, both anesthetic and, weeks later, the substance flowing freely at the small, rough, entirely sincere gathering the crew held to mark his recovery. Proof of a kind that a system built almost entirely around violence and self-interest still found room, now and then, for something that looked a great deal like loyalty. By the time your ship sets out again, restocked, rum casks refilled from what remains of Nassau's chaotic supply. You've learned the actual shape of pirate drinking culture, not the lawless free for all of popular imagination, but something stranger and more specific. A tightly regulated ration during working hours, real freedom and real excess after a hard-won prize, and, running underneath all of it, a set of collectively written rules that governed not just how much rum a man could drink, but what his ship owed him if the work that earned that rum cost him a piece of himself. The rum a pirate crew drank in Nassau, and the rum a Royal Navy sailor drew from the grog tub, both traced back to the same brutal economic machine. One that used rum not just as a product to sell, but as a currency to buy and sell human beings. Picture Newport, Rhode Island, on a cold night sometime in the 1760s. Along the town's waterfront, more than a dozen distilleries. By some contemporary estimates, Newport alone was home to over 20 working rum distilleries by this point in the 18th century, an extraordinary concentration for a town of only a few thousand people, keep their furnaces burning through the night, converting barrels of Caribbean molasses into a cheaper, rougher rum than anything coming out of Barbados or Jamaica. Distilled specifically for one purpose, trading it on the coast of West Africa for human beings. This is the triangular trade, the economic system that historians consider one of the central engines of the entire Atlantic slave trade. And rum, the same drink you've now followed from a boiling house kettle to a pirate ship's rum tub, sat at its very center. Here's how the mechanics actually worked, stripped down to its coldest arithmetic. New England ships, loaded with locally distilled rum, sailed to trading posts along the West African coast, the Gold Coast, the Bight of Benin, ports like Anamabu and Cape Coast Castle, where that rum was traded, alongside textiles, firearms, and other manufactured goods, for enslaved men, women, and children captured or purchased by African and European intermediaries operating an already well-established regional trade network. Those enslaved people were then transported across the Atlantic on the notorious Middle Passage, a voyage that historians estimate killed somewhere between 10 and 20% of everyone forced aboard, depending on the ship, the route, and the era. Before those who survived were sold in the Caribbean or the American mainland colonies, most commonly for sugar and molasses, which were then shipped back to New England to be distilled into more rum. 3 legs, 1 triangle, and an enormous, sustained flow of human suffering running through every point of it. Rum's specific exchange rate in this trade, how much of it actually took to purchase a human being, varied enormously by period, port, and negotiating leverage, and surviving trade records from different decades and different traders show substantial variation rather than one fixed price. But the documented pattern is consistent, and damning regardless of the exact numbers on any given voyage, rum was one of the most consistently demanded commodities among African traders and rulers along the coast. Valuable enough that it became, alongside firearms and cloth, one of the standard currencies of the entire trade. A single Rhode Island merchant house, the De Wolfe family of Bristol, is among the most thoroughly documented examples in American historical records. The family conducted dozens of slaving voyages between the 1780s and the trade's formal abolition in 1808, using rum distilled from their own Bristol facilities as a core part of their trading cargo, and built one of early America's largest family fortunes doing it. Their history survives in unusual detail, precisely because it was never hidden. Slave trading was a legal, socially accepted business in colonial New England for well over a century, conducted openly by respected merchant families whose names still mark streets and buildings across Rhode Island and Massachusetts today. Historians who've worked to quantify the scale of this specific rum for people exchange caution, consistently, that the surviving records are incomplete and scattered across too many private merchant ledgers, colonial customs records, and ships' manifests to produce one single, fully confident number, but even the conservative estimates that have emerged from decades of archival research are staggering on their own terms. Some scholarly reconstructions of the trade suggest New England alone may have exported well over 100,000 gallons of rum annually to the West African coast by the mid-18th century, a volume large enough that rum functioned for substantial stretches of the trade's history. As one of the 2 or 3 most important commodities New England shipped abroad in any category, ahead of nearly everything the region actually grew or manufactured for its own domestic use. That's not a rounding error in a broader colonial economy. That's an entire regional economic engine, built substantially around one specific currency-grade export, whose primary market for over a century was the deliberate, sustained purchase of human beings. Boston, alongside Newport, built its own substantial share of this same rum economy, and the scale of it is worth putting in concrete terms rather than leaving it as an abstraction. By the mid-18th century, colonial Massachusetts alone was home to dozens of working rum distilleries, and historians estimate New England as a whole was producing several million gallons of rum annually by the 1760s. The overwhelming majority of it distilled from molasses imported specifically from Caribbean sugar plantations, rather than grown or refined locally in any way. Boston's own harbor, a generation before it became famous for a very different kind of tea-related protest, functioned as one of the busiest rum trading ports in the entire British Atlantic world. Ships arriving loaded with Caribbean molasses, departing loaded with finished rum bound in substantial part for the West African coast, in a cycle that repeated itself. Voyage after voyage, decade after decade, largely without interruption, until the American Revolution finally disrupted the whole transatlantic system it depended on. This is where the historical record forces an uncomfortable connection that's worth sitting with directly rather than skating past. The same molasses and rum economy that produced the sweet, celebratory rum punch served at Barbadian plantation weddings. The same rum that filled a Royal Navy sailor's daily grog tub, and the same rum that flowed freely through a pirate crew's celebration after a good prize, all of it traced back, at least in significant part, to an economic engine that treated human lives as one more commodity, to be measured, priced, and traded alongside barrels and bolts of cloth. There was no separate, clean rum industry sitting apart from the slave trade. It was, structurally, the same industry, running on the same ships, filling the same warehouses, generating profit for the same families across multiple generations. British colonial authorities, for their part, were far less interested in the trade's human cost than in who was profiting from which leg of it, and that indifference produced one of the more direct threads connecting rum to the American Revolution itself. The Molasses Act of 1733 imposed a substantial duty on molasses imported into the American colonies from any source other than British Caribbean islands, specifically targeting the cheaper French Caribbean molasses that New England distillers, including Newport's own, had come to depend on. Colonial distillers responded the way colonists facing an unpopular tax reliably did. They ignored it, almost entirely. Smuggling French molasses became so widespread and so openly tolerated by colonial officials themselves, some of whom were quietly profiting from the very smuggling they were nominally supposed to prevent, that the Molasses Act is remembered by most historians today as one of the most comprehensively unenforced pieces of legislation in the history of the British Empire. Parliament tried again 3 decades later, and this time it stuck. The Sugar Act of 1764 actually reduced the nominal duty on foreign molasses compared to the 1733 law, but paired that reduction with dramatically stricter enforcement mechanisms, new customs procedures, expanded use of Vice Admiralty courts that tried smuggling cases without juries, and a real, functioning effort to collect the revenue the earlier act had only theorized about. New England's rum distillers, dependent on cheap foreign molasses to keep their product competitively priced, felt the squeeze immediately and vocally. And the Sugar Act is counted by many historians among the opening grievances in the chain of escalating colonial resentment that would culminate, a decade later, in outright rebellion. Some later commentators went so far as to credit rum and molasses with a direct hand in American independence itself, a claim that's more evocative than strictly provable, and worth treating with the same caution the historical record deserves whenever a story gets a little too tidy. But the underlying economic thread is real. A rum industry built substantially on the machinery of the slave trade helped generate the exact colonial anger that, within 12 years of the Sugar Act, boiled over into war. The tension between colonial rum smugglers and British enforcement efforts eventually produced open, physical confrontation, not just legislative grievance, and one specific 1772 incident in Rhode Island waters shows exactly how far that conflict had escalated less than a decade after the Sugar Act first tightened enforcement. The Hms Gaspee, a British customs schooner tasked with hunting down smugglers along the Rhode Island coast, ran aground while pursuing a suspected vessel near Warwick, and that night, a group of local colonists, merchants and sailors from a community whose economy depended substantially on exactly the kind of smuggled molasses trade the Gaspee existed to suppress, rowed out, boarded the stranded schooner, wounded its commanding officer, and burned the ship to the waterline. Colonial authorities never successfully identified or prosecuted anyone involved, despite a royal commission of inquiry and a substantial reward offered for information. A silence that speaks for itself about how broadly the surrounding community supported, or at minimum tolerated, the attack. The Gaspee affair is remembered by many historians as one of the more direct, physically violent precursors to the revolution itself, predating the more famous Boston Tea Party by almost exactly a year. And it happened, not coincidentally, in the heart of the same Rhode Island rum and molasses economy this whole chapter has been tracing from its distillery furnaces straight through to its role in the slave trade. That war, and the eventual formal abolition of the American slave trade in 1808, didn't end New England's relationship with rum, but it did mark the beginning of a long decline in the industry's centrality to the region's economy. Domestic whiskey, distilled from grain grown on the young nation's own expanding frontier rather than imported Caribbean molasses, gradually displaced rum as America's dominant spirit through the early 19th century. A shift accelerated by geography as much as taste, since grain distilleries could be built anywhere corn or rye grew, while rum production remained tethered to a supply chain running back through the Caribbean. Newport's more than 20 distilleries, so dominant a presence along its 18th century waterfront, dwindled steadily across the decades that followed, their furnaces going cold one by one, until what had briefly been one of colonial America's largest and most consequential industries survived mostly in old account ledgers, old family fortunes, and the quiet, uncomfortable fact that some of early America's grandest houses were built on rum that had, at some point along its journey, been traded directly for a human life. That fortune didn't simply vanish when the trade itself was formally abolished, and its physical traces remain visible today, in ways historians and local communities alike have only begun seriously reckoning with in recent decades. The DeWolf family's grand houses still stand in Bristol, Rhode Island, preserved as historic architecture rather than demolished or forgotten. And in the early 2000s, descendants of the family publicly confronted their own ancestors' role in the trade, participating in a widely discussed documentary project that traced the family's slaving voyages in detail and retraced, in person, some of the same Atlantic route their ancestors' rum-laden ships had once sailed. It's an unusually direct, unusually documented example of a broader reckoning many New England communities have only recently begun undertaking. Historical societies, museums and universities across Rhode Island and Massachusetts increasingly working to trace and publicly acknowledge exactly how much of the region's colonial-era wealth, prestige, and grand architecture trace back, however many generations removed, to rum casks traded for human beings on a distant coast. The rum itself is long gone from any of it. The houses, the street names, and the inherited fortunes, in more places than most casual visitors realize, are not. It's worth pausing on one popular version of this story that doesn't quite hold up, because getting it right matters more than repeating something memorable. A quotation sometimes attributed to John Adams, describing molasses as an essential ingredient in American independence, gets cited fairly often in popular retellings of this history. But historians who've traced the line back through its sources have generally found it either substantially altered from anything Adams actually wrote, or unattributable to him at all in the specific, tidy form it usually circulates in. That doesn't erase the real documented economic connection between the Molasses Act, the Sugar Act, New England's rum industry, and rising colonial resentment. That thread is genuine and well established. But the specific punchy one-liner is exactly the kind of thing this story doesn't need. The underlying facts are damning enough on their own, without borrowing a quote that probably isn't real. The human beings actually carried across the Atlantic within this system did, in a handful of cases, leave behind their own accounts, and they're worth naming even briefly, because so much of this chapter has necessarily been told through the perspective of the traders, the merchants, and the account ledgers, rather than the people the ledgers were describing. Olaudah Equiano, an African man who was enslaved as a child and later purchased his own freedom, published a widely read narrative in 1789 describing conditions aboard a slave ship during the Middle Passage in visceral, specific detail: the crowding, the heat, the disease that spread rapidly through the hold, conditions that historians studying the broader trade have found broadly consistent with ships' logs and surviving records from other vessels of the same era. Equiano's account doesn't specifically describe a rum trading voyage of the kind New England ships were running, and his own experience was one case among an estimated 12 million people forced across the Atlantic over the trade's roughly 4-century span, a number so large it resists real comprehension, which is itself part of why individual documented accounts like his matter as much as they do. They're the closest thing this history has to a name and a voice pushing back against a system that otherwise reduced human beings over and over again to entries in a merchant's ledger, priced against barrels of rum. Resistance within that system, however limited its options, was real and recurring, and the historical record documents it far more often than popular memory tends to credit. Uprisings aboard slave ships themselves, while never guaranteed to succeed and frequently met with brutal suppression, occurred with enough regularity across the trade's history that ship captains and insurers treated the risk as a routine cost of doing business, factored into everything from crew size to the design of below-deck restraints. On land, enslaved people who ended up owned by New England's rum merchants and distillers, a smaller scale, less documented but genuine feature of the region's slave-holding history, distinct from the larger plantation systems of the Caribbean and the American South, resisted through the same patience. Incremental means enslaved people employed everywhere: work slowdowns, escape, informal economies, and the passing of knowledge and support from person to person that we already saw at work inside the boiling house earlier tonight. None of it dismantled the system on its own. All of it mattered anyway, the same way it mattered on every sugar estate this rum trade ever touched. There's one more figure this triangular economy touches, and he's about to give rum its most famous, most legendary, and, as we'll see, most disputed association of all: a pirate captain whose reported final words, according to a source historians still argue about, blamed his violent death on the very drink his own crew had been swilling for years. If one single pirate is responsible for cementing rum's reputation in the popular imagination, it's the one whose own crew, according to a source of famously disputed reliability, once got so deep into a barrel of it that they tried to see how much hell a man could stand and still keep breathing. On the morning of November 22nd, 1718, in the shallow waters off Ocracoke Island in present-day North Carolina, a Royal Navy lieutenant named Robert Maynard led 2 small sloops in a direct assault against a pirate captain who had, by that point, spent roughly 2 years becoming the single most feared name on the eastern seaboard of North America. The fight was brutal and close, fought largely hand-to-hand once Maynard's men swarmed the pirate sloop, and it ended with the pirate captain dead, killed, according to Maynard's own official report to Virginia's governor. Only after sustaining what the report describes as 5 gunshot wounds and something on the order of 20 sword cuts before he finally went down. His head was severed and hung from the bowsprit of Maynard's ship as proof of the kill, sailed back to Virginia as evidence that one of the most notorious pirates of the age was, unambiguously, no longer a threat to anyone. This is the story of Blackbeard, the man whose brief, violent career would come to define, more than almost any other single figure, exactly what the world imagines when it imagines a pirate, rum included. Before the legend, there was simply a man whose actual documented biography is far thinner than the mythology built on top of it. His name is usually given as Edward Teach, though contemporary sources spell it inconsistently. Thatch and Thake both appear in period documents, and virtually nothing reliable survives about his life before he emerges into the historical record around 1716. Already an experienced sailor serving under an established pirate captain named Benjamin Hornigold. This is worth stating plainly. Blackbeard's active career as an independent pirate captain lasted, from beginning to end, something close to 2 years. 2 years to build a reputation ferocious and enduring enough that his name is still instantly recognizable 3 centuries later, a testament less, perhaps, to the length of his career than to how deliberately, theatrically violent his self-presentation actually was. His apprenticeship under Hornigold is worth a moment of its own attention, because it shows a side of Blackbeard's development the later, more theatrical legend tends to skip past entirely, a working pirate learning the trade methodically, under an experienced commander, rather than emerging fully formed as the fearsome captain the popular imagination remembers. Hornigold, operating out of the loosely governed pirate haven at Nassau, was by most contemporary accounts a relatively cautious commander for a pirate captain, reportedly avoiding attacks on English shipping specifically, even while freely raiding French and Spanish vessels, a restraint some of his own crew, including Teach, eventually grew impatient with. When Hornigold accepted a royal pardon in 1718 and retired from piracy, a decision that put him at odds with crewmates hungrier for continued plunder, Teach had already split off with his own vessel and his own growing reputation, taking a portion of Hornigold's former crew with him. It's a small, easily overlooked detail, but it matters. The man who became Blackbeard didn't simply appear on the historical stage as a fully formed legend. He served an apprenticeship first, under a real, documented commander, learning the trade before striking out to build the reputation that would eventually eclipse his old captains entirely. That theatrical self-presentation is where the legend and the documented record start to blur together, and it's worth being honest, right at the start, about which parts of Blackbeard's story rest on solid ground, and which parts trace back to a single, contested source. Much of the popular imagery, the long black beard reportedly braided with ribbons, the slow-burning hemp fuses supposedly tucked under his hat and lit before battle, so that smoke curled around his face like something out of a nightmare, comes primarily from Captain Charles Johnson's 1724 book, A General History of the Pirates, a text whose own authorship remains disputed among historians and which is well documented to have dramatized, embellished, and in places likely invented material well beyond what any surviving trial record or official correspondence can independently confirm. None of that means the imagery is necessarily false. Some of it likely reflects genuine, if exaggerated, contemporary accounts of a real man who clearly understood the tactical and psychological value of looking as terrifying as possible before a fight even started. But it means every specific, vivid detail from that source, including, as we're about to see, one particular rum-soaked legend, deserves the according to legend framing, rather than flat, unqualified statement as historical fact. What is far better documented is the ship that made Blackbeard's brief career possible in the first place. In late 1717, he and his crew captured a French slave ship called La Concorde off the coast of Martinique, a vessel that had been transporting several hundred enslaved Africans at the time of its capture. A detail modern accounts of Blackbeard's career sometimes gloss over entirely, but one that connects his story directly back to the same slave-trading Atlantic economy this whole night has been tracing. Blackbeard converted the captured vessel into his flagship, renaming it Queen Anne's Revenge, and outfitting it with somewhere around 40 cannon, making it, for a brief period, one of the most heavily armed pirate vessels operating anywhere in the Atlantic. This is the story of the Queen Anne's Revenge, the ship that turned an experienced but relatively minor pirate into a genuine regional power, a vessel whose wreck, believed identified off the coast of Beaufort, North Carolina in 1996, has since yielded thousands of recovered artifacts, giving modern archaeologists and historians one of the few genuinely physical, verifiable windows into exactly how a real Golden Age pirate ship was actually equipped. By May of 1718, commanding a small flotilla built around the Queen Anne's Revenge, Blackbeard staged one of the boldest documented acts of his entire career, a blockade of Charleston Harbor in the colony of South Carolina, holding a handful of captured vessels and their passengers hostage for several days and demanding, ultimately successfully, a chest of medical supplies from the colony's government in exchange for releasing them unharmed. This episode is unusually well documented compared to much of the rest of his career, recorded in colonial correspondence and contemporary newspaper accounts, rather than relying on Johnson's later, more theatrical retelling. And it reveals something genuinely strategic about Blackbeard's methods that the swashbuckling legend tends to obscure. This was less a spontaneous act of violence than a calculated hostage negotiation, conducted by a man who understood exactly what leverage he held and precisely how far he could push a colonial government before it would rather pay than fight. The flag popularly associated with Blackbeard today, a horned skeleton toasting the devil while spearing a bleeding heart, deserves the same cautious treatment as the beard ribbons and the smoking fuses. No contemporary eyewitness account or trial deposition from Blackbeard's own lifetime describes this specific design flying from his ship. The image appears to be a later addition to his legend, likely assembled and popularized well after his death as the broader mythology around him continued accumulating detail no surviving document from 1717 or 1718 actually supports. What better documented sources do confirm is simply that Blackbeard, like most pirate captains of the era, flew some version of a black flag bearing threatening imagery specifically intended to intimidate a target vessel into surrendering without a fight. Since a bloodless surrender saved a pirate crew the real risk of injury or death that any actual engagement carried. The specific horned skeleton has become so thoroughly associated with his name in the centuries since that separating the documented practice from the embellished detail feels almost beside the point to most people encountering the story today. which is, in its own way, exactly how a legend like this one is built. One plausible, unverifiable addition at a time, until the invented details feel as solid as the documented ones. Not long after the Charleston blockade, Blackbeard made a decision that, in hindsight, marks the beginning of his downfall, though it looked at the time like a genuinely sensible retirement plan. He accepted a royal pardon offered under King George I's 1717 Act of Grace, a formal amnesty program designed to convince working pirates to abandon the trade in exchange for a clean legal slate, and settled for a time in Bath, North Carolina, reportedly cultivating a relationship with the colony's governor, Charles Eden, that historians have long suspected, though never conclusively proven, involved the governor turning a convenient blind eye to Blackbeard's continued, quieter piracy, in exchange for a cut of the proceeds. Whatever the exact truth of that arrangement, it's clear Blackbeard never fully abandoned the trade the pardon was supposed to end, resuming raids along the Carolina coast through the autumn of 1718 with a much smaller crew than he'd commanded at his peak, having by then deliberately run the Queen Anne's Revenge aground and abandoned most of his larger flotilla, a decision some historians read as a calculated move to reduce his crew and keep a larger personal share of the remaining plunder for himself, and a smaller, more loyal inner circle. This is where the most famous rum story attached to Blackbeard's name actually enters the record. And it comes, like so much else about him, from Johnson's disputed 1724 account rather than any court document or eyewitness deposition. According to that telling, Blackbeard once gathered a small group of his men below decks, sealed the hold, and set alight several pots of sulphur and other combustible material, creating a suffocating, hellish atmosphere, reportedly daring his companions to see who could endure the choking fumes longest, supposedly declaring, in Johnson's paraphrased account of the moment, something to the effect of proposing they make their own hell and see how long they could stand it, with rum flowing freely throughout to keep the whole grim experiment going. Whether that scene happened as described, happened in some less theatrical form, or was invented outright by a book already documented to dramatize its subjects, no independent source confirms. It survives today not because historians consider it reliable, but because it captures something genuinely consistent with what the better documented parts of Blackbeard's career suggest about the man. A captain who understood that fear, spectacle, and a reputation for genuinely reckless disregard for his own safety were, in the absence of overwhelming firepower, among the most effective weapons a pirate captain actually had. The end, when it came, was fast and was not legendary at all. It was recorded, in reasonably sober detail, by the man who delivered it. Governor Alexander Spotswood of Virginia, increasingly alarmed by Blackbeard's continued activity along a coastline he considered his own colony's responsibility to protect, despite Blackbeard technically operating out of North Carolina waters, authorized Lieutenant Robert Maynard to lead an expedition against him without formal permission from North Carolina's own governor, a jurisdictional overreach that caused its own diplomatic headaches afterward, but one Spotswood judged worth the risk. Maynard found Blackbeard's sloop anchored at Ocracoke Inlet on the morning of November 22, 1718, and after an initial cannon exchange that badly damaged one of Maynard's two ships, the fighting turned to close. Brutal hand-to-hand combat once the vessels came alongside each other. Maynard's own account describes Blackbeard fighting with what reads, even in the flat procedural language of an official report, as genuinely ferocious resistance, sustaining wound after wound and continuing to fight regardless, before finally collapsing from what the report tallies as 5 gunshot wounds and roughly 20 separate sword cuts. The men who'd sailed with him didn't simply vanish from the record either, and their fates, taken together, round out the story in ways the legend usually skips over. 15 surviving crew members were captured in the fighting at Ocracoke and transported to Williamsburg for trial. Court records from that proceeding, considerably more reliable than Johnson's later embellished retelling of the captain they'd served under, show most of them convicted and hanged within weeks. A swift, unambiguous colonial response meant to broadcast exactly what fate awaited anyone tempted to follow a similar path. A small number were acquitted or pardoned, including at least one man whose testimony helped establish the extent of Governor Eden's suspected quiet cooperation with Blackbeard during his supposed retirement. An implication serious enough to trigger a formal inquiry back in London. Though Eden himself was never removed from office or formally convicted of wrongdoing before his death from illness in 1722, leaving the full truth of that arrangement permanently, frustratingly unresolved. What grew up around Blackbeard's name in the decades and centuries that followed his death owes at least as much to storytellers as to any surviving court record. And it's worth flagging plainly, one more time, given how much of this chapter has already had to draw that same line. Persistent local legend around Ocracoke and the broader Carolina coast holds that Blackbeard buried substantial treasure somewhere along the shore before his final battle. A story with no supporting evidence in any surviving document and every hallmark of the kind of folklore that accretes naturally around any sufficiently famous, sufficiently violent historical figure once enough generations have had the chance to retell his story. No documented treasure cache tied to Blackbeard has ever been recovered, despite periodic amateur searches along that coastline continuing well into the modern era. The wreck of the Queen Anne's Revenge, by contrast, is real, physically verified, and still being carefully excavated by professional archaeologists today. A reminder that the most durable, most genuinely valuable pieces of this legend were never the buried gold the stories promised, but the actual ship, sitting in shallow water off Beaufort for nearly 3 centuries, waiting to tell historians what the legend never could. His severed head, mounted on the bowsprit of Maynard's ship as proof of the kill for the bounty Spotswood had authorized, made the return voyage to Virginia as grim, undeniable evidence, a piece of theatre every bit as calculated, in its own way as anything Blackbeard himself had staged during his career. Whatever the precise truth of the rum and gunpowder legend, whatever embellishments Johnson's account layered onto an already dramatic life, the underlying facts need no exaggeration at all. A man who spent perhaps 2 years as an independent pirate captain, commanding a converted slave ship rebuilt into one of the most heavily armed pirate vessels of his era, successfully blockading a colonial capital, and dying in close combat against overwhelming odds rather than surrendering, had already secured a place in maritime legend well before any storyteller needed to invent a single additional detail. The rum, real or embellished, was never really the point. It was simply one more prop in the performance of a man who understood, better than almost any pirate of his generation, exactly how much fear a reputation alone could buy. 2 centuries after Vernon's furious sailors first grumbled over their watered-down ration, the ritual he'd accidentally invented had become one of the most reliable, most anticipated rhythms of daily life aboard a Royal Navy warship, and it's worth actually living through a single day of it before we watch that whole tradition finally come to an end. The pipe wakes you before the sun fully clears the horizon, a sharp, specific whistle from the boatswain's call that every man aboard learns to distinguish from a dozen other signals within his first few weeks at sea. This one meaning simply all hands, rousing you out of a hammock slung so close to the next man's that you can hear him breathing before you can see him in the grey pre-dawn light below decks. It's sometime in the early 1800s, aboard a Royal Navy ship of the line somewhere in the Atlantic, and the air below decks already carries the particular smell of several hundred men living in close, poorly ventilated quarters, tar, bilge water, damp wool, and underneath it, faint but unmistakable, the ghost of yesterday's rum still clinging to the deck seams the way it clings to nearly every surface on a ship that's poured this same ritual daily for years. The sheer logistics of keeping this ritual running, fleet-wide, day after day, across years-long commissions, is easy to take for granted once you're living inside it. But it's worth appreciating for a moment just how much organizational effort the daily tot actually demanded. A single ship of the line on a lengthy foreign commission typically carried enough rum in its hold to sustain months of continuous daily rationing for several hundred men, stored in large casks that had to be carefully managed, rotated, and guarded against both spoilage and theft for the entire duration of a voyage that could easily stretch past a year without returning to a home port for resupply. Multiply that single ship's requirements across an entire fleet maintaining stations scattered from the Mediterranean to the Caribbean to the coast of India, and the Admiralty's supply chain for rum alone becomes a genuinely substantial piece of naval logistics in its own right. Contracts with Caribbean rum producers, shipping schedules coordinated around it, warehousing at major naval ports specifically dedicated to keeping the ritual supplied without interruption. It's easy, sitting in the queue waiting for your own tot, to think of the ration as simple and small. Keeping it running, without fail, across an empire's worth of ships for 2.5 centuries was anything but. Your first hours are consumed with the ordinary, unglamorous machinery of running a warship, stowing hammocks, scrubbing deck, checking rigging, and it's during this stretch of the morning that you properly meet Thomas Kell, a weathered able seaman who's been aboard this particular ship for 9 years, longer than almost anyone else in your mess, and who takes it upon himself, without much ceremony, to explain exactly how the day's most anticipated ritual actually works before you embarrass yourself in front of the whole crew by getting it wrong. Kell has a habit of narrating ship's routine half under his breath as he works. Less for your benefit specifically than simple long habit, and it's from him you learn the brass measure used to portion out each man's ration is called a tot, holding precisely 1/8 of a pint by regulation, and that the large wooden tub the rum gets mixed in carries brass lettering reading the king, God bless him, or the queen, depending on who happens to be on the throne that particular decade, fixed to its side, a small permanent piece of institutional ceremony wrapped around what is, at bottom, just a very old drinking custom. By late morning, the tempo of the ship shifts in a way every hand aboard can feel coming before the actual signal sounds. A kind of anticipatory hum running through the lower decks that Kell, watching you notice it for the first time, tells you never really goes away no matter how many years you've served. Then it comes, the boatswain's distinctive call, followed by the cry every man aboard has been waiting for since breakfast. Up spirits, the official signal that the rum is about to be mixed and served, drawn from the ship's spirit room by the purser's steward under armed escort. Because a supply this valuable, and this capable of causing chaos if mishandled, is never left unguarded, even for the short walk from storage to the mixing tub. The mixing itself is its own small piece of theatre, one you watch with real attention your first time through it, because Kell has made clear it's worth paying attention to. Water and rum get combined in the tub at the standard ratio, by this period reduced somewhat from the ratio Vernon originally set nearly a century earlier. Part of the gradual tightening of the ration we touched on when this story first crossed paths with him, and stirred together in full view of the assembled crew, specifically so that no man can later claim, or suspect, that his own share was shorted by an officer skimming from the mix before it reached the tub. Here's the thing about that public mixing. It's not really about the rum at all. It's about trust, made visible in a hierarchical, often brutally disciplined institution that otherwise gave ordinary sailors very few guarantees about anything. Your own tot, when it finally reaches you, is smaller than you expected and gone in seconds. This isn't a leisurely drink. It's a quick, practiced motion repeated identically by several hundred men in succession, cued by division. Each man's name checked against a muster roll to make sure no one draws twice, and no one, particularly no one under the age generally considered old enough to receive the full ration, draws at all. Kell downs his in the same unhurried automatic motion he's clearly repeated thousands of times before. And it's only afterward, watching him pocket a small folded chit from a younger sailor 2 places down the line, that you understand you've just witnessed a sipper's transaction exactly like the ones we discussed earlier tonight. A debt from some earlier favor, quietly settled in the one currency nearly every man aboard reliably has. By your 3rd week aboard, you've started to notice the quieter mechanics running underneath the ritual's cheerful surface. The way certain older hands seem to accumulate more sippers and gulpers than anyone could plausibly need, for simple enjoyment. Trading the surplus for tasks, information and small favors in an informal economy that officers mostly chose not to see, so long as it didn't spill over into outright drunkenness on duty. You've also, by this point, watched the ship's more severe side of rum discipline in action. A topman 2 divisions over caught genuinely drunk during an afternoon watch, hauled before the officer of the deck, and sentenced to a flogging administered the following morning in front of the assembled crew, a punishment whose brutality period naval regulations spelled out in exacting, almost bureaucratic detail regarding the number of lashes permitted for a given offence, delivered by the boatswain's mate with the entire crew required to watch in silence. Flogging wasn't actually the ration's most common disciplinary shadow, Kell tells you afterward, correcting an assumption you hadn't realized you'd made. For smaller infractions, the far more routine punishment was simply stoppage of grog, a temporary suspension of a man's daily tot for a set number of days, used by officers for offences ranging from minor insubordination to sloppy work that didn't rise to the level of a formal flogging offence. It sounds mild compared to the lash, and by any physical measure it obviously was. But Kell describes it, with the flat certainty of a man who's watched it applied dozens of times, as one of the more quietly effective disciplinary tools available to any officer aboard. Precisely because the ration meant so much more to most sailors than its modest alcohol content alone could explain. Losing your tot for 3 or 4 days didn't just mean going without a drink. It meant standing conspicuously outside the one shared ritual every other man on your watch got to participate in. A small, daily, entirely public reminder of exactly whose good graces you'd need to work your way back into. Congratulations. You've now seen both faces of the same institution in the span of a single month. A daily ritual generous enough to build genuine camaraderie and an informal shipboard economy around it. And a disciplinary system harsh enough to flog a man bloody for taking that same institution's generosity one measure too far. Kell has one more story he tells you during this stretch of your service, one he's careful to flag, unprompted, as something he can't personally vouch for, a piece of naval folklore rather than a fact he witnessed himself. After Admiral Horatio Nelson died at the Battle of Trafalgar in October of 1805, the popular telling goes, his body was preserved in a cask of spirits for the long voyage back to England. And sailors ever since have referred to Navy rum by the nickname Nelson's Blood, a grim, half-affectionate bit of shorthand tying the whole ritual directly back to one of the Navy's most mourned heroes. Whether Nelson's body was actually preserved in rum specifically, as opposed to brandy or another spirit entirely, is a detail different historical accounts disagree on, and the further embellishment sometimes attached to the story that sailors aboard the return voyage secretly tapped the cask and drank from it before the body reached England has no reliable documentary support at all and belongs, by most serious historians' assessment, squarely in the same category as Blackbeard's rum and gunpowder legend, a story too good, too fitting, and too undocumented to take at face value, however durable its hold on naval folklore has proven to be. Kell tells it anyway, the way sailors always have. Because a legend doesn't need to be verified to do its job of binding a crew together around a shared story. Even the water used to dilute the rum carried its own small, practical logic worth knowing, because it explains something about why the ritual took the exact shape it did rather than some simpler alternative. Fresh water aboard a long-commission warship was itself a carefully rationed, often none too pleasant resource by the later weeks of a voyage, stored in wooden casks that could pick up a stagnant, faintly foul taste over months at sea, and mixing that water with rum, sugar, and a splash of citrus did more than just stretch the ration and curb drunkenness. It made an increasingly unpleasant necessity easier to get down, turning a chore of survival into something sailors genuinely looked forward to. Kell, explaining this to you one afternoon with the patient, slightly amused tone of a man repeating something he clearly enjoys repeating, puts it more simply than any official regulation ever bothered to. Grog wasn't just rum with the edges taken off. It was the ship's own drinking water, made bearable, dressed up in just enough ceremony that nobody aboard had to think too hard about where it had actually come from. 6 months into your service, the ship engages in a brief, sharp action against a smaller enemy vessel, and you watch the ration's other function play out in real time. An extra tot, ordered by the captain for the entire crew immediately after securing the prize, the exact splice the main-brace tradition Kell had described weeks earlier as one of the genuine, uncomplicated good moments naval service occasionally offered. Kell himself takes a wound in the action, a musket ball through the meat of his upper arm that the ship's surgeon manages to treat without amputation. And you learn, sitting with him during his recovery in the sick berth, about the Royal Hospital for Seamen at Greenwich, a long-established institution, founded under Royal Charter in 1694, providing pensioned care for naval veterans disabled or worn out in service, funded in part by a compulsory deduction taken from every serving sailor's own pay. It's an imperfect, often grudgingly administered system, and Kell, with the dry, unsentimental humor of a man who's clearly had this exact conversation with new hands many times before, tells you not to count on it solving all your problems if your own turn for a serious wound ever comes. But it's there on the books, a formal acknowledgement, however incomplete, that a navy asking men to bleed for it owed something back in return, an echo, in its own more bureaucratic register, of the same compensation logic we watched a pirate crew's articles write down explicitly a few chapters ago. By the time your first full commission winds toward its end, 2 years by this point, of the same daily rhythm, the same pipe at dawn, the same brass-lettered tub, the same quick practiced tot swallowed in seconds and gone, the ritual has stopped feeling like a novelty and started feeling like something closer to the ship's actual heartbeat, the one fixed, reliable point around which every other harder, more uncertain part of naval life seemed to organize itself. Kell, recovered from his wound, tells you on your last night aboard together that he's served under 4 different captains, 3 different ships, and 1 change of monarch, and the one thing that's never once changed in all that time is the sound of that pipe calling up spirits, and the particular, specific comfort of knowing, whatever else the day holds, that call is coming. What neither of you could have known, what no sailor drawing a tot from that brass-lettered tub at any point across the better part of 2.5 centuries could have known, is that the ritual, this exact ritual, would eventually end. Not through mutiny, not through some catastrophic accident finally forcing reform, but quietly, by administrative decision. On a specific afternoon in the summer of 1970, when an entire navy would gather one final time around the same tub, for the same reason, for the very last time. 230 years is a long time for any ritual to survive largely unchanged, and by the late 1960s, the Royal Navy's own leadership had quietly concluded that this one, however beloved, simply couldn't anymore. You wake on the morning of July 31st, 1970, aboard a Royal Navy vessel somewhere in home waters, already aware, everyone aboard has been aware for months. Ever since the announcement first came down from the Admiralty Board in a parliamentary statement given in December of the previous year, that today is different. The air below decks carries the same familiar smell it always has. Tar and salt and the ghost of rum worked so deeply into the deck seams over 2 centuries that it will likely never fully leave. But there's a different quality to the morning quiet. The kind that settles over a ship when everyone aboard knows they're about to watch something end that they'd assumed, without ever really examining the assumption, would simply always be there. You've come to know Alec Ferris well over your 2 years serving alongside him, a signalman a few years older than you, whose own grandfather, he's told you more than once, served through the Second World War and used to describe the Daily Tot in almost exactly the same terms Thomas Kell once used with you. Not really about the alcohol at all, but about the fixed point it gave a day. The one guaranteed moment of shared ritual in an institution that otherwise ran almost entirely on rules, hierarchy, and uncertainty. Ferris has spent the past several weeks quietly gathering opinions from older hands across the ship about exactly why the Admiralty finally pulled the plug on something that had survived 2 world wars. And the answer he keeps coming back with isn't sentimental at all, it's mechanical. The formal announcement, back in December of 1969, came through a written statement to the House of Commons on behalf of the Admiralty Board, laying out the safety rationale plainly enough that even sailors reading second-hand newspaper summaries of it, months before the actual end date arrived, understood exactly what was coming and exactly why. It wasn't framed as a moral judgment against drinking, and Ferris is careful to make that distinction clear. Whenever the subject comes up among the crew, nobody in the Admiralty was arguing rum itself was somehow shameful or improper. The argument was narrower and, in its own dry bureaucratic way, harder to actually dispute, a fighting force that increasingly depended on split-second technical precision from ordinary sailors at literally any hour of a modern watch rotation, simply couldn't keep issuing a daily dose of alcohol to every man aboard and expect that precision to hold up consistently across an entire fleet. 230 years of tradition, weighed against that argument, didn't stand much of a chance. However loudly, however genuinely, however many sailors across the fleet mourned it on the actual day it finally came. Here's the actual argument that ended the ration. Stripped of nostalgia, by 1970, Royal Navy ships had become dramatically more complex than anything Vernon or his 18th century successors could have imagined, packed with sophisticated electronic and mechanical systems, guided missile equipment, and machinery that demanded a level of sustained precision and split-second judgment that even a modest daily dose of alcohol was judged, by the Admiralty Board's own internal assessment, to meaningfully compromise. A report submitted to Parliament ahead of the final decision laid out the concern plainly. Modern naval operations increasingly required sailors to be capable of instantly and precisely operating complex machinery at literally any hour, a standard the old daily ration, however modest by 18th century measures, was judged incompatible with. The debate in Parliament that followed, once the recommendation became public, was reportedly lively enough that it earned itself the half-joking nickname of the Great Rum Debate among the members involved. A small acknowledgement, even from the government's own benches, that ending a 230-year tradition wasn't a decision to be made lightly, however sound the underlying safety argument actually was. By mid-morning, the ship's normal routine proceeds almost exactly as it always has, which somehow makes the day feel stranger rather than more ordinary. The same watch rotations, the same maintenance checks, the same rhythm of shipboard life that's carried on through every other change the Navy has weathered across its long history. It's only as 11 o'clock approaches, the traditional hour for up spirits aboard most ships of this era, that the difference becomes impossible to ignore. Ferris tells you, as you both make your way toward the muster point, that several ships across the fleet are marking the occasion with genuine ceremony, rather than letting it pass quietly. Mock funeral processions organized by ships' companies on more than one vessel, complete with black-draped rum barrels borne on makeshift biers, black armbands worn by sailors who'd normally never think to dress for a drinking ritual, and on at least one ship, by later accounts, an actual wreath committed to the sea, in a small, half-serious, half-genuinely mournful gesture of naval theatre. Not every officer aboard shared the lower deck's sense of loss in quite the same way, and it's worth noting that distinction honestly, rather than flattening the whole fleet into a single mood that day. Wardroom officers, who had generally drawn from separate wine and spirit stores rather than the standard tot throughout the ration's long history, were losing a tradition they'd mostly observed from the outside, rather than one that had structured their own daily rhythm the way it had structured Kell's or Ferris's. Some senior officers, by later accounts, welcomed the change plainly and without much sentiment at all, having spent careers managing exactly the discipline problems a daily alcohol ration could produce, and viewing its end as straightforward, overdue good sense, rather than any kind of loss worth mourning. That gap in how the day actually felt, deck to deck, is its own small, honest reminder that a single ship, let alone an entire fleet, rarely experiences even its most defining rituals in quite the same way from every rank at once. Word passes along the ship, relayed the way most interesting news travels aboard a vessel this size, second-hand, sailor to sailor, embellished slightly with each retelling. Thatham's Fife has gone furthest of any ship in the fleet, staging a full mock funeral procession complete with a small coffin-shaped box representing the departed ration, carried the length of the deck by pallbearers in a slow, deliberately solemn march before being committed to the sea, accompanied by a lone bugler and a company of sailors standing at attention in a display equal parts genuine sentiment and dry naval humor about the whole occasion. Other ships, by the accounts filtering back to your own crew over the following days, marked the day more simply. A black armband here, a hand-lettered in memoriam notice pinned up in a mess deck there, but the underlying impulse seems to run the same current through nearly every vessel in the fleet that morning, whatever anyone actually thought about the safety argument behind the decision. Nobody wanted to let 230 years of daily ritual end without some acknowledgement that something real was actually being lost. Your own ship keeps things simpler, but no less pointed. The bosun's pipe sounds, up spirits is called one final time, and the tub, the same wooden tub with its brass lettering, the one that summoned men to this exact ritual across generations of sailors none of you ever met, gets mixed and measured out precisely as it always has. The eighth of a pint tot, poured with exactly the same careful public precision that's always been the ritual's whole point. There's noticeably less talk in the queue than usual. Nobody's in a hurry to reach the front of the line the way they might be on an ordinary day. Because reaching the front of the line today means the whole thing. For this ship, and every other ship in the fleet, is actually and permanently finished. You drink your last tot slower than you've ever drunk one before, and Ferris, standing beside you, doesn't say anything at all for a long moment afterward, which, if you've learned anything about him over 2 years of service together, tells you more than any speech could have. It's not really the rum he's going to miss, he finally says, echoing almost word for word what he'd told you his grandfather used to say about the very same ration decades earlier. It's the pipe. It's the tub with the lettering. It's the specific, reliable shape the ritual gave to an otherwise unpredictable life at sea. a fixed point 2.5 centuries of sailors had been able to count on, gone now, by administrative decision, in the space of a single afternoon. The Admiralty didn't leave the fleet with nothing in its place, and it's worth being fair to what actually replaced the Daily Tot, rather than treating its end as simple loss. Sailors received a modest daily allowance in its place, commonly remembered across the fleet as an extra can of beer added to the daily ration, along with a small increase in general shipboard amenity funding, a trade the Admiralty judged, on balance, a reasonable exchange for the safety benefits of a fully sober watch rotation. Some older hands, Kell's generation and Ferris's grandfather's generation both, reportedly found the substitute a poor one, regardless of the math. Precisely because the point of the Daily Tot had never really been about the specific quantity of alcohol involved. It had been about the ceremony wrapped around it, and ceremonies, once broken, are notoriously difficult to rebuild in any form that feels like the genuine original. In the years that followed, as Ferris's own naval career carried him from young signalman to, eventually, a much more senior rank, he'd occasionally cross paths with veterans of Kell's generation and older, men who'd served through the ration's final decades and who spoke about Black Tot Day, when it came up at all, with a specific, recognizable tone. Not quite grief, not quite nostalgia, but something adjacent to both. The particular fondness people reserve for a small daily comfort they never appreciated fully until it was gone. Naval oral history projects conducted in the decades since have recorded dozens of these recollections from sailors who lived through the ration's final years, and a striking number of them, independently, land on almost exactly the same observation Kell had offered you years earlier, and Ferris's own grandfather had apparently offered him before that the rum itself was never really the point. It was the 15 seconds of shared ceremony built around it, repeated identically by every man aboard, every single day, across a career that might otherwise have felt like nothing but hard labor, harsh discipline, and long stretches of open water between one uncertain destination and the next. Decades later, that single afternoon would even generate its own small commercial afterlife, one that Ferris, watching the whole ceremony wind down that evening, couldn't possibly have anticipated. Surplus stocks of the Royal Navy's own official rum, set aside and never issued before the ration ended, were eventually rediscovered, bottled and released commercially by specialist producers decades later, under names directly invoking the occasion, bottlings marketed specifically to rum collectors and historians as genuine surviving liquid, connected to the exact stores that would have filled that brass-lettered tub, had July 31st, 1970, been an ordinary day rather than the last one. Rum enthusiasts in the years since have taken to informally marking the anniversary itself, gathering each July 31st in small, scattered, entirely unofficial commemorations that Ferris, hearing about the custom second-hand many years into his eventual retirement, reportedly found both faintly absurd and quietly moving in roughly equal measure. A ritual about the end of a ritual, outliving by decades the very ration it exists to remember. What survived, in the years and decades that followed Black Tot Day, is its own small, strange postscript worth sitting with before we bring this whole long story to a close. Splice the main brace, the old order for an extra celebratory tot, remains in ceremonial use by the Royal Navy even now. More than 50 years after the daily ration it once supplemented quietly disappeared, invoked on special occasions, a phrase surviving long past the custom that gave it meaning. In the same strange, durable way grog itself survived long past Vice Admiral Edward Vernon and his unpopular 1740 order. Some of the last remaining sealed casks of official Royal Navy rum, preserved rather than issued, have surfaced in the decades since at auction and in museum collections. Treated today as genuine historical artifacts rather than beverages, their contents worth vastly more as preserved history than they ever were as a daily ration, and in an echo that would have felt entirely familiar to the Barbadian planters who accidentally invented this whole enterprise 300 years earlier by wondering whether spoiled molasses might be worth drinking. A modern wave of small batch and craft rum distillers across the Caribbean and well beyond it continues turning out spirits today that trace their technique, however distantly, back to those same first crude copper stills, proof that whatever else changed across 3 centuries of empire, war, slavery, and reform, the basic, improbable idea at the center of this whole story never actually went away. Someone, somewhere, is still looking at sugarcane byproduct and asking exactly the same question a nameless Barbadian distiller asked back in 1651. Can we drink that? And the answer, still, after all this time, remains yes. So that's rum. A hot, hellish, terrible drink that somebody in Barbados decided to try anyway, sometime around 1650, out of nothing more than a boiling house's leftover sludge. It became a beaner's careful hands guiding a ladle between 4 copper kettles under a heat that never really broke. It became an admiral's furious, unpopular order to water down a ration, an insult so effective it gave the English language a brand new word. It became Prince's compensation, counted out in front of a whole crew, because a piece of paper they'd all signed said his suffering was worth exactly 800 pieces of 8. It became the currency that moved human beings across an ocean, a fact this story never tried to soften, because softening it would have been its own kind of lie. It became a legend about a man named Blackbeard sealing himself below decks to see how much hell he could stand, a story historians still can't fully verify, and probably never will. And on one quiet afternoon in the summer of 1970, it became Alec Ferris, standing at a brass-lettered tub, drinking the very last official tot the Royal Navy would ever pour, mourning not the alcohol itself, but the specific, reliable shape of a ritual that had outlasted admirals, empires, and 2 full centuries of war, 300 years, and the whole enormous, complicated story still traces back to the same simple question a nameless distiller once asked while staring at a barrel of spoiled molasses he probably should have thrown away. Can we drink that? Somebody said yes, and empires, navies, pirate crews, and an entire transatlantic economy of almost unimaginable cruelty and quiet resilience grew up around the answer. You're not on that ship anymore. You're not in that boiling house, not standing at that tub, not lying wounded in that sick berth, waiting to find out whether the surgeon can save your arm. You're here. Wherever here is for you tonight, warm, dry, with nothing more urgent ahead of you than sleep. You're warm. You're safe. And whatever the tide brought in tonight, out there in the dark past 3 centuries of history, it isn't coming for you. Rest now. That's enough. Tonight, that's everything.